There is a place at the edge of the world where the oldest story on Earth is still being told, not written down, not carved into the walls of a museum or buried beneath the pages of a textbook, spoken, sung, danced into the red dust of the earth itself in ceremonies so old that the memories they carry stretch back to a time before the pyramids existed, before Stonehenge was laid stone by stone across the green fields of England, before the great empires of Rome and Greece and Mesopotamia had even imagined themselves into being. This place is a continent, the driest inhabited continent on the planet, the flattest, in many ways the most ancient, a land so geologically stable that its rocks have barely moved in hundreds of millions of years. A land that separated from the rest of the world long before human beings ever set foot on it and drifted slowly and silently into the Southern Ocean, carrying with it the oldest continuous human culture that has ever existed. The question that sits at the heart of everything we're about to explore tonight is not simply how old this place is. The question is how, in a land this isolated, this seemingly removed from the great surges of history and civilization, the most sophisticated, the most ancient, the most enduring human tradition on the face of the earth took root and survived. And not just survived, thrived across 65,000 years of continuous memory. If this kind of slow, quiet journey through history is something you find yourself returning to, consider subscribing so that new episodes find you as you settle in each night. Leaving a comment below about which part of tonight's story stays with you also helps more people find their way to this channel. And if you're watching for the first time, welcome. There is no rush here. Everything moves slowly. Let us begin at the beginning, or as close to the beginning as we are currently able to place ourselves. Somewhere in the northern reaches of what is now Australia, on the very edge of a great golden plateau called Arnhem Land, there is a rock shelter. It sits beneath an enormous sandstone cliff, the kind of cliff that has been worn smooth over millennia by wind and rain and the passing of seasons beyond easy counting. The shelter is called Majid Bebe. In the language of the Mirarr people, whose country this has always been, the name carries meanings that reach deep into the earth itself. Archaeologists first began to take serious notice of Majid Bebe in the 1970s, but it was not until the excavations of 2012 and 2015 and 2017 that the site gave up its most astonishing secret. As researchers carefully removed layer after layer of sediment, using tools so precise and movements so deliberate that the work resembled something closer to surgery than excavation, they began to find objects that should not, by any previous reckoning, have been there. Ground edge hatchets. These are not simple stones used for bashing. These are tools that required the sustained, patient grinding of stone against stone over long periods of time, an act that demands planning, a concept of the future, a sense that the effort invested now will be rewarded later. The hatchets found at Majid Bebe are the oldest ground edge hatchets ever discovered anywhere on the planet. There were also grinding stones covered in the residue of ancient plant pigments. There were reflective pieces of mica, almost certainly used for ornamentation. There was ochre, that deep red mineral which, across the entire span of human prehistory, has carried the weight of ceremony and ritual and meaning. And then there was the sediment itself. Dated using a technique called optically stimulated luminescence, which measures the last time sand grains were exposed to light before being buried. The lowest layers at Majid Bebi return dates that stopped the archaeological world in its tracks. 65,000 years, perhaps older still. The people who sat beneath that rock shelter, who ground their hatchets and prepared their ochre, and perhaps looked out across a landscape that was, in many ways, quite different from the one that exists today, were doing so at a time when much of Europe was still being shaped by the last great ice age, at a time when Neanderthals still walked the earth, at a time when the woolly mammoth grazed across the cold plains of the northern hemisphere, and the sea levels were so much lower that the northern coastline of Australia extended far further into what is now open ocean. 65,000 years of continuous human presence on a single continent. The implications of that number are almost impossible to hold in the mind all at once. So we will come to them slowly. We will let them arrive the way the light arrives at dawn, gradually and with great patience until the full shape of the thing becomes visible. When we speak of 65,000 years, we are speaking of a span of time roughly 8 times longer than the entire written record of human history. We are speaking of a span that encompasses the extinction of the Neanderthals, the last glacial maximum, the end of the Ice Age, the flooding of coastal lands worldwide as sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, the development of agriculture in the Middle East, the rise and fall of every major civilization in the historical record, and everything that has happened since, all the way to this moment. As the night settles around you and these words find their way to you, all of that, contained within the continuous memory of a single cultural tradition, to understand why Australia became the home of the world's oldest continuous culture, it helps to understand something about the nature of the land itself. Australia is old in a way that most of the earth is not. The continent sits on one of the most ancient and stable geological platforms on the planet, the Australian Craton, a body of rock so old and so unchanged that geologists describe it using words usually reserved for deep time. Parts of the Pilbara region in Western Australia contain rock formations that are somewhere between 3 and 4 billion years old. To put that in perspective, the Earth itself is approximately 4.5 billion years old. The rocks of the Pilbara were already ancient when the first simple organisms were beginning to stir in the world's primordial oceans. This geological stability has shaped everything about the continent. It is why Australia is so flat. The great mountain building processes that have periodically crumpled and thrust upward other parts of the Earth's crust have largely left Australia alone. The mountains that exist here, including the Eastern Highlands and the ancient ranges of the West, are worn down remnants of far older ranges, smoothed by hundreds of millions of years of erosion into gentle rolling forms, where other continents have dramatic jagged peaks thrust skyward by the collision of tectonic plates. Australia has the quiet, rounded humility of things very, very old. It is also why the soils of much of Australia are ancient and depleted in ways that soils in younger lands are not. In places that have been periodically renewed by glacial activity or volcanic deposition, soils are rich and fertile. Australia has had relatively little of either over vast stretches of geological time. The result is a landscape of remarkable, spare beauty, but one that requires of its inhabitants a profound understanding of how to read it, how to work with it, how to sustain a relationship with the land that is both careful and deeply knowledgeable. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who have lived on this land for 65,000 years developed exactly that kind of relationship. not despite the difficulty of the land, but because of it. When the ancestors of the first Australians arrived on the continent, probably crossing from what is now Southeast Asia via a combination of land bridges and short sea crossings during a period of lower sea levels, they entered a world of extraordinary strangeness. The megafauna of ancient Australia included creatures that exist nowhere else and that have no living equivalents today. Diprotodon, a rhinoceros-sized marsupial; Procoptodon, a giant short-faced kangaroo that stood nearly 2 meters tall; Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, a predator of formidable power; Palocestes, sometimes described as a marsupial tapir, though the reality was stranger than that description suggests; Genyornis, a giant flightless bird that stood over 2 meters and weighed more than 200 kilograms, stalking the open grasslands of a continent that would have seemed to newly arrived human eyes like something from another world entirely. The relationship between the arrival of humans and the disappearance of these megafauna is a question that archaeologists and ecologists have been debating for decades and have not yet fully resolved. What is certain is that by the time the megafauna were gone, the first Australians had developed an understanding of their landscape that was layered and intricate and encoded in ways that would allow it to be transmitted across generations without the need for written records. This is the first of the great puzzles that tonight's story turns upon. How do you preserve knowledge across 65,000 years without writing it down? The answer, as we will discover, is both simpler and more profound than anything a library could achieve. There is a dry lake bed in the far southwest of New South Wales, in a region that was once the fringe of a vast, now vanished inland sea called Lake Mungo. Today, the landscape around it is one of the most hauntingly beautiful in all of Australia. The lunettes, those great curving walls of wind-blown sediment, rise from the flat plain in slow cream-colored curves. The light in this place at dawn and at dusk takes on qualities that are difficult to describe, a kind of ancient amber warmth that makes the landscape feel both very still and very aware. If you were to stand at the edge of one of those lunettes in the early morning and look out across the flat plain below, you would see a landscape that has barely changed in the broad outlines of its appearance for many thousands of years. The same pale grasses, the same low shrubs, the same dry salt pan at the center of the lake bed, gleaming white in the long horizontal light. The same enormous sky above it all, blue shading to the palest possible gold at the horizon. In 1968, a geologist named Jim Bowler was conducting fieldwork in the area. Walking along the eroded face of one of the lunettes, he noticed something in the sediment that made him stop. What he had found would change the way the world understood not only Australian prehistory, but human prehistory globally. He had found human remains, a cremation, the cremated bones of a young woman, buried with such deliberate care and ceremony that there could be no question about the intentional nature of the act. She became known as Mungo Lady, and she was, at the time of her discovery, the oldest cremation ever recorded anywhere on Earth. Later dating placed her remains at somewhere between 24,000 and 40,000 years old, with subsequent analysis pushing towards the upper end of that range. 3 years later, Jim Bowler returned to Lake Mungo. This time he found something else. The ochre-stained skeleton of a man, his hands folded across his body, his remains dusted with the red mineral in a gesture that speaks unmistakably of ritual, of care, of a belief in something beyond the moment of death itself. Mungo Man, as he became known, was dated to at least 40,000 years ago, and some analyses have placed his remains considerably older. Here, in the eroding sediment of a dry lake in what is now outback New South Wales, was evidence of a ceremony, of grief, of a considered relationship with death that is not so different from what human beings do today. When they gather around the remains of someone they have loved, the ochre on Mungo Man's bones is not just a mineral, it is an intention. It is the physical trace of someone standing over the body of another person and deciding that this moment deserved marking, that this life had mattered, that something needed to be done 40,000 years ago. The Muti Muti, Nyampa and Pakanti peoples are the traditional custodians of the Lake Mungo region. For them, the story of Mungo Lady and Mungo Man is not simply a matter of archaeological record. It is a matter of ancestry. These are their old people. And their old people, it turns out, were engaging in acts of ceremonial mourning at a time when the great cave painters of Lascaux were still at least 5,000 years away from picking up their first piece of charcoal. Let that settle for a moment. The red ochre on the bones of Mungo Man predates the cave paintings of Lascaux by something in the order of 15 to 20,000 years. There is a question that follows naturally from what was found at Lake Mungo, and it is a question that reaches far beyond archaeology into philosophy and theology and everything that makes us human. What does it mean that the impulse to honor the dead, to mark the passing of a person with ceremony and care, was present in Australia 40,000 years ago? It means that the people who lived here were, in every sense that matters, people, not proto-human, not primitive in any meaningful sense, not in a stage of development that is somehow less than what came later. They were people who loved, people who grieved, people who believed that death was an event of significance and that the body of someone who had died deserved to be treated with respect. People who had developed rituals for managing the overwhelming weight of loss. They were, in short, us. There is a question that follows naturally from the evidence of Majid Bebe and Lake Mungo. And it is a question that gets to the very heart of what makes the first Australian story so remarkable. If a culture has been continuous for 65,000 years, what does it actually remember? This is not a rhetorical question. It has been tested, and the answers are extraordinary. Around the entire coastline of Australia and extending deep into the interior, there is a body of oral tradition maintained across countless generations through the ceremonial practices known broadly as the dreaming, that contains within it memories of geological and climatic events that occurred thousands of years before the development of writing anywhere in the world. The dreaming, or the dream time, is a term that is both inadequate and imprecise as a translation of what it refers to, but it is the term most widely used outside of the specific language groups to which these traditions belong. Within different communities and different language groups, this concept is referred to differently, and it carries different specific meanings, but at its most general, it refers to the eternal framework of creation and law and relationship out of which the physical world, the natural world, and the social world are all understood to have emerged. It is not something that happened in the past and ended. It is ongoing. It is happening now. It is the underlying reality beneath the surface of things. The word often translated as dreaming in English is, in different languages, something more like the law, or the ever-present, or the time before time that is also right now. The English word dreamtime, with its connotations of sleep and unreality, misses something essential. The traditions it refers to are not understood by the people who hold them as stories about things that may or may not have happened. They are understood as the foundational reality of the world, as true and as present and as binding as anything experienced in waking life. The stories contained within the dreaming traditions of various Aboriginal communities have been collected and studied by linguists, anthropologists, and geologists for over a century. What the geologists in particular have found is that many of these stories contain accurate and detailed descriptions of geological events that, according to the physical evidence, happened thousands of years ago. One of the most striking examples concerns the Narrinyeri people of what is now South Australia. Their traditional stories describe a time when the land bridge connecting Kangaroo Island to the Australian mainland was still intact, when the waters had not yet risen to cover it. Kangaroo Island separated from the mainland approximately 10,000 years ago, when rising sea levels following the end of the last ice age inundated the land bridge. The Narrinyeri stories, passed down across approximately 400 generations, remember this event accurately, not as myth in the sense of an invented narrative, but as something that actually happened and was witnessed and was preserved in the memory of the community. This pattern repeats itself across the continent. In Western Australia, the oral traditions of communities along the Dampier archipelago describe the flooding of what is now ocean floor, land that was above water until sea levels rose in the period between 7,000 and 12,000 years ago. In Queensland, similar traditions describe the flooding of the Gulf of Carpentaria region. In the Northern Territory, stories preserve the memory of a time when the landscape looked fundamentally different, when the coastlines were further out and the rivers ran differently. In Victoria, the Djab Wurrung people have stories that describe the eruption of volcanoes in what is now the Western Plains, a region that was geologically active until at least 35,000 years ago. The stories describe fire rising from the earth, ash falling, the landscape being remade. Geological surveys of the region have confirmed that volcanic events of the kind described in these traditions did occur there, at dates that are consistent with the possibility of human witnesses. A landmark study published in the journal Australian Geographer in 2016 by geologists Patrick Nunn and Nicholas Reid examined 21 different oral traditions from around the Australian coast and concluded that they contained accurate memories of sea level changes that occurred between 7,000 and 12,000 years ago. In other words, these stories have been accurately transmitted across somewhere between 250 and 500 generations. Nothing in the written historical record comes close to this. The oldest written historical records from ancient Mesopotamia date back approximately 5,000 years. The oldest sections of the Vedic tradition in India, which has its own remarkable continuity, date back perhaps 3,000 to 4,000 years in written form. The oral traditions of the first Australians that have been verified against geological evidence stretch back more than twice as far. How is this possible? How does knowledge survive across hundreds of generations without being written down? The answer lies in the sophistication of the systems developed for its preservation. In the world that the first Australians built across the Australian continent, knowledge was not stored in objects. It was stored in people, in ceremony, in song, in the landscape itself. The concept of songlines, which has been written about extensively by the anthropologist Bruce Chatwin and many others, is one of the most elegant and sophisticated systems of knowledge preservation ever developed by any human culture. The idea, at its simplest, is that the landscape of Australia is covered by an invisible network of paths, tracks that were walked by the ancestral beings of the dreaming as they moved across the country and, in moving, created it. The hills, the waterholes, the rocks, the trees, the distinctive features of the terrain all came into existence through the actions and movements of these ancestral beings. And the stories of those actions, encoded in song, map the landscape with remarkable precision. To travel along a song line was not simply to walk a path, it was to sing a path. The correct song, performed at the correct location in the correct sequence, serves simultaneously as a navigational guide, a historical record, a cosmological statement, and a map of the relationships between different communities whose territories the songline traversed. Different communities held different sections of the same songline, and the connections between those sections provided a framework for inter-community relationships, trade, ceremony, and diplomacy that stretched across thousands of kilometers. The songs were not metaphors for the landscape, they were the landscape. The features described in the song corresponded directly to features of the physical terrain. A traveler who knew the song could use it to navigate with complete reliability, even across country they had never personally visited, because the song described what they would find there with the precision of a map. But unlike a map, a song is alive. It is a living thing that requires a living person to carry it and transmit it. It changes slightly in the telling, absorbs new meanings, carries the personality of the singer. And yet, within those variations, the essential geographical and historical information remains stable across extraordinary spans of time because it is tested against the physical landscape every time it is performed. A singer who gets the geography wrong will be corrected by the land itself. This is an epistemological system of remarkable sophistication. It builds error correction directly into the process of transmission. It uses the permanence of the landscape as its archive, and it distributes the responsibility for knowledge preservation across an entire community, so that no single loss of a single individual can destroy the record. It is, in other words, a distributed knowledge system that would be entirely recognizable to anyone familiar with the architecture of modern information technology, redundancy, error correction, distribution across multiple nodes, and the whole thing held together not by hardware, not by software, but by ceremony and song and the deep human desire to remember. The songlines also served another function that is easy to overlook, but was of enormous practical importance. They were trade routes. The paths followed by the ancestral beings were also the paths along which goods and people and ideas moved across the continent. Ochre from particular sources known for the quality of their pigment. Stone tools made from specific flints or quartzites prized for their sharpness. Seeds, shell ornaments, feathers, sacred objects. All of these moved along the songline networks across distances that, by any reasonable measure, constitute a continental trade system of considerable sophistication. The exchange networks that linked Aboriginal communities across Australia were, in some cases, demonstrated to be thousands of kilometres in extent. Shells from the Queensland coast have been found at archaeological sites deep in the Western Australian desert. Stone from outcrops in Central Australia has been found in coastal sites hundreds of kilometres away. These are not accidental dispersals. They are the traces of deliberate, organized systems of exchange that served both practical and ceremonial purposes, and that required the kind of sustained, reliable social relationships that only well-maintained networks can provide. And those networks were maintained through the shared language of the dreaming, through the obligation of hospitality and exchange that the ceremonial system created between communities, through the songlines that connected them all into a single continent-spanning web. In the Kimberley region of Western Australia, in the northwest of the continent where the ancient landscape is at its most dramatic, there are rock paintings of a type found nowhere else on Earth. They depict figures that are entirely distinct from the kind of rock art found in most other parts of the world. They are elongated with round heads and no mouths. They float above the landscape in postures that suggest movement, ceremony, the crossing of some boundary between the ordinary world and the world beneath or beyond it. They are sometimes accompanied by animals, sometimes by geometric designs, sometimes by other figures that are more human in their proportions. These figures are called guion or sometimes Bradshaw figures, the latter name being that of the European pastoralist who brought them to wider attention in 1891. The Ngarian people, whose country this is, know them as guion, and their stories about who painted them are stories that carry the weight of deep time. Dating the guion has been extraordinarily difficult, partly because the pigments used in their creation have long since been absorbed into and replaced by the rock itself, making direct chemical dating impossible. However, researchers have found fossilized wasp nests built over the paintings, and these have been dated to a minimum of 17,000 years ago, suggesting that the paintings beneath them are at least that old. Some researchers have proposed much older dates on the basis of stylistic analysis and the geological context. What is certain is that whoever painted these figures was working with a sophisticated artistic vision, with a clear sense of proportion and movement and narrative, at a time when Europe's famous cave art tradition was either just beginning or had not yet reached its peak. The guion are not unique in the ancient rock art tradition of Australia. They are part of the largest and oldest collection of rock art anywhere on the planet. That collection is concentrated primarily on the Burrup Peninsula, also known by its Ngarluma name Murujuga, on the far northwest coast of Western Australia. The peninsula is a place of extraordinary visual complexity, a jumble of ancient red rocks piled on top of each other, in formations that look like the ruins of some enormous and very old structure, though they were created entirely by geological forces. And between and on those rocks, covering an area of approximately 45 square kilometers, are the petroglyphs. Petroglyphs, engravings made by pecking and abrading the stone surface with harder stones, creating images that range from the geometric and abstract to the extraordinarily detailed and realistic. At Murujuga, there are estimated to be somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million individual engravings, making it the largest collection of petroglyphs in the world. The oldest among them are estimated at somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 years old, though the difficulty of dating engravings, which leave no organic material that can be directly carbon dated, means that some researchers have proposed even earlier dates. Among them are images of animals that are no longer found on the Australian mainland and that went extinct thousands of years ago. There are images of the thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, which disappeared from mainland Australia approximately 3,000 years ago, but which left its traces on the rocks of the Burrup Peninsula at a time when it was still a common presence in the landscape. There are images of fish and marine mammals engraved on rocks that are now above the high tide line, but that were once, when sea levels were lower, close to or beneath the surface of the ocean. There are also images of human figures engaged in ceremony, of ancestral beings whose forms stretch and shift between the human and the animal and the abstract, of geometric patterns whose meanings are held within the traditions of the Ngarluma, Yaburara, Mardudunera, and Wangutu peoples whose ancestors made them. The rocks of Murujuga are not just a gallery, they are a library, they are a calendar. They are a record of 40,000 or more years of engagement with a landscape, of observation of the animals and plants and weather and sea that sustained life there, of the ceremonial and cosmological understanding that gave meaning to that life. And they are currently at risk. The Burrup Peninsula sits in the middle of one of Australia's most significant industrial zones. The Burrup Hub, a major centre for liquefied natural gas processing. The chemicals emitted by industrial activity in the area have been identified by researchers as a potential threat to the preservation of the ancient rock art. The conversation about how to balance economic development against the preservation of what is, by any measure, one of the most significant cultural and historical sites on the planet is ongoing, and it is a conversation that carries very large stakes. The Murujuga Aboriginal Corporation, which represents the traditional owners of the site, has been engaged in advocacy for stronger protections for the rock art for many years. In 2023, the Australian government nominated Murujuga for inscription on the UNESCO World Heritage List, a process that, if successful, would place it among the most formally protected cultural sites in the world. The nomination described the site as a place of universal outstanding value, and it is difficult to argue with that description. 1 million engravings covering 45 square kilometers, spanning 50,000 years of human art and observation and ceremony. There is nowhere else like it on Earth. Let us travel south now, down along the ancient coast, through country that has been occupied for longer than almost anywhere else on Earth, and come to rest in the southwest of the state of Victoria, in a region of wetlands and rivers and low green hills that, even to eyes accustomed to the great diversity of Australian landscapes, has a particular quietness to it. This is the country of the Gunditjmara people, and in this country something was built that has fundamentally changed the way archaeologists and historians understand the possibilities of ancient human civilization. The site is called Budj Bim. The name refers to a large shield volcano, now dormant, whose eruptions approximately 30,000 years ago sent lava flowing across the landscape to the south and southeast. As the lava cooled, it formed a complex system of channels and pools and rocky outcrops across the lower reaches of the Budj Bim landscape that provided, to people who understood how to read the terrain, the raw material for something remarkable. The Gunditjmara people built a system of aquaculture, the oldest known aquaculture system anywhere on the planet. They modified the natural channels left by the lava flows to create a network of weirs and traps and holding pools, a system engineered to harvest the short-finned eel, a species that migrates through these waterways in enormous numbers, and that was, for the Gunditjmara, a food source of extraordinary richness and reliability. Smoked and dried eel could be preserved and traded over long distances. The system at Budge Bim produced enough eel not just to sustain the local community, but to generate a surplus that fed a substantial trade economy. The construction of the system required both engineering knowledge and social organization of a high order. The weirs needed to be built to the right height and in the right locations to control the flow of water through the trap system. The holding pools needed to be large enough to maintain live eels in captivity while preventing them from escaping. The channels needed to be maintained and cleared regularly to function effectively. All of this required coordination, planning, and a body of technical knowledge that had been developed and refined over many generations. The age of the Budge Bim aquaculture system was confirmed by a series of studies using radiocarbon dating and other techniques. The system is at least 6,600 years old, though some elements of it may be considerably older. To place that date in perspective, it predates the construction of Stonehenge in England by at least 1,000 years. It predates the pyramids of Giza by approximately 400 years. At the time, the Gunditjmara were engineering their eel traps and weirs. The great cities of Mesopotamia, often described as the cradles of civilization, were in their earliest phases. The discovery of Budge Bim required a fundamental rethinking of the standard narrative about the development of complex human societies. That narrative, which was dominant in Western academic thought for most of the 20th century, held that civilization, meaning settled communities, large-scale food production, trade networks, and permanent built infrastructure, arose independently in a small number of locations around the world, all of them in the Northern Hemisphere, and then spread outward. Australia, in this narrative, was understood as a continent of nomadic hunter-gatherers, whose sophistication, while culturally rich, did not extend to the kinds of engineered infrastructure that most scholars associated with civilized complexity. Budge Bim demolished this narrative. Here was permanent, large-scale, engineered aquaculture infrastructure, 6,600 years old, sitting in what most scholars had assumed was a continent of nomads. Here were villages, actual semi-permanent stone-walled structures built close to the eel traps, where the Gunditjmara lived during the eel harvesting seasons. Here was the physical evidence of a settled, resource-managing, trade-conducting society of considerable sophistication. And it had been here, maintained and used across hundreds of generations, since long before anyone had imagined it was possible. The Gunditjmara were not unusual in having this kind of sophisticated relationship with their landscape. Across the continent, different communities had developed different strategies for sustained, managed harvesting of different resources. The Brewarina fish traps in New South Wales, a system of stone weirs across the Barwon River, are another example, estimated by some researchers to be as much as 40,000 years old, which would make them among the oldest human constructions on Earth. The Bradley's headshell middens in Sydney Harbour, the complex seed grinding systems of the arid zones, the elaborate fire stick farming techniques practiced across the continent, all of these speak to an engagement with the landscape that was managed, deliberate, and sustained across extraordinary spans of time. This was not passive occupation, it was active management, a form of land stewardship that maintained the productivity and diversity of the Australian landscape across a time span that dwarfs anything achieved by any agricultural civilization anywhere else on the planet. In 2019, the Budge Bim cultural landscape which includes the Budge Bim volcano, the eel traps, and the associated archaeological sites, was added to the UNESCO World Heritage List. It is the only entirely Aboriginal cultural landscape to have been inscribed on that list. And it was inscribed on the basis of the engineering, the management, the economy, and the 66th century continuity of a people's relationship with a place. There is a circle of standing stones on a low hill above the Hopkins River Valley in western Victoria. The local Djab Wurrung and Jardwajali peoples have known about it always. Europeans became aware of it in the 1970s, when an astronomer named Dwayne Hammaker, working with Aboriginal elders, began to examine whether the stones at Wurdi Yuwang, as the site is known, might have astronomical alignments. What they found was that they did. The stones form an egg-shaped arrangement roughly 50 meters in diameter. The site contains approximately 90 standing basalt stones of varying sizes. Some of the larger stones, which sit along one end of the oval, are aligned with the sunset at the equinoxes and the solstices. If you stand at the large stone at the narrow end of the oval and look along the axis of the arrangement, you are looking directly at the point on the horizon where the sun sets at the winter solstice. The alignment with the summer solstice, the equinoxes, and key calendar positions is, according to the researchers who have studied it, too precise and too consistent to be accidental. This is significant for several reasons. It means that the people who built Wurdi Yuwang had developed a sophisticated understanding of solar astronomy. They knew where the sun would rise and set at different times of year. They understood the cycle of the seasons well enough to mark its key turning points in stone. And they chose to do so in a way that would be visible and usable across generations. Dating Wurdi Yuwang has been difficult, as with many stone arrangements, but the researchers who have studied it believe it may be between 11,000 and 20,000 years old. If the higher end of this estimate is correct, Wurdi Yuwang is the oldest astronomical structure on Earth, predating Stonehenge, the pyramids, and the ancient observatory at Gozek in Germany by thousands of years. The Aboriginal Australians were not, of course, the only ancient culture to observe and track the movements of the sun and stars. Astronomical observation appears to be nearly universal among ancient human cultures. What makes the Australian tradition distinctive is, again, its continuity. The astronomical knowledge encoded in sites like Wurdi Yuwang was not abandoned and rediscovered. It was maintained within living traditions across centuries and millennia, tested and refined through ongoing observation, integrated into the ceremonial and practical life of the communities that held it. Researchers who have spent time working with Aboriginal elders on questions of astronomical knowledge have described encountering a depth and precision of sky knowledge that is genuinely astonishing. Knowledge of star positions and their seasonal movements that provides reliable navigational information. Knowledge of the cycles of particular stars that serves as a calendar for the appearance of certain food sources, the movements of certain animals, the right times for certain ceremonies. Knowledge of the relationship between celestial and terrestrial cycles that has been maintained and refined across a span of time that the written astronomical tradition, for all its achievements, cannot approach. The emu in the sky, perhaps the most distinctive example of Aboriginal astronomical tradition, is a constellation formed not by the stars themselves but by the dark patches between the stars. Where European and Middle Eastern astronomical traditions looked at the night sky and connected the bright points into shapes, The Aboriginal astronomical tradition of many regions also used the dark nebulae, the patches of darkness created by dust clouds in the Milky Way, to form constellation figures. The MU formed from the dark nebulae that stretch across the central band of the Milky Way appears to run across the sky in a position that, when it is horizontal, indicates that the emus on the ground are laying their eggs. When the emu in the sky is vertical, it is time to go looking for eggs. This is astronomy in the service of life. Celestial observation integrated directly into the practical requirements of survival in a specific landscape. And it works. It has worked reliably across hundreds of generations. But the astronomical traditions of the first Australians go considerably beyond the use of the sky as a calendar, remarkable as that is. There are stories in several Aboriginal traditions that describe the nature of the dark patches of the Milky Way in ways that are astronomically accurate, describing them as clouds of dust and gas. There are traditions that appear to encode the knowledge that the Milky Way is a structure of which our own sun is a part, a structure that can be observed from the Earth as a band of light across the sky. There are observations about the movements of particular stars and planets that have been verified by astronomers as accurate. We do not know, and may never fully know, the depth of the astronomical understanding contained within the oral traditions of the first Australians, because so much of that knowledge is sacred and not available to outside researchers, and because so much was disrupted by the events of colonization. What we do know is enough to suggest that the astronomical tradition here was sophisticated beyond what most people who haven't studied it would guess. In the Northern Territory, in country that has never been separated from its traditional owners, there are rock shelters whose walls carry paintings that span an enormous sweep of time. The most spectacular of these sites are in Kakadu National Park, one of the largest national parks in Australia, a place of staggering natural beauty and cultural depth. Kakadu's sandstone escarpment rises from the floodplain of the alligator rivers in great vertical walls of orange and red and grey, its surface pitted with caves and overhangs and shelters that have provided refuge and ceremony for human beings for at least 40,000 years, and possibly much longer. The paintings in these shelters are not the work of a single era or a single tradition. They are a layered record, paintings made at different periods on top of and beside earlier paintings, the whole accumulation forming something like an archive of artistic and ceremonial practice across an immense span of time. The oldest paintings, X-ray style images that depict the internal anatomy of animals alongside their external form, are found beneath layers of later painting in a way that suggests continuous use of the same sites across many generations. X-ray art is one of the most distinctive and visually arresting art forms ever produced by any human culture. In X-ray painting, the animal or person depicted is shown not just from the outside, but from the inside as well, with bones and organs visible through the outer surface. The effect is deeply strange and deeply beautiful, a kind of double vision that sees the living creature and its inner workings simultaneously. The tradition has been interpreted in many ways by researchers. Some have suggested that the X-ray style reflects a practical knowledge of anatomy gained through hunting and butchering. Others have proposed spiritual interpretations, connecting the visibility of the inner body to ideas about the relationship between the visible and invisible worlds. The Bininj and Mungai peoples whose ancestors made these paintings have their own understandings of what they mean and why they were made. understandings that are embedded in the dreaming traditions of the country and that are not always available to outside researchers. What is unambiguous is that the artists who created the X-ray paintings of Kakadu were operating at a level of visual sophistication, of confident and deliberate artistic intention that deserves to be discussed in the same breath as any of the great artistic traditions of the ancient world. The paintings of Kakadu are also remarkable for what they tell us about the animals and plants and landscapes of the deep past. Among the species depicted in the oldest layers are animals that are no longer present in the Kakadu region, and in some cases no longer present anywhere. The thylacine appears in Kakadu rock art, so do animals that researchers have not been able to identify with certainty. Creatures that may represent species now extinct, preserved in paint long after the last individual of that species died. This is the rock art as natural history, as a visual record of a changing ecosystem, maintained across a span of time that no written natural history even approaches. The continent of Australia is shaped by extremes. The far north is tropical, wet in the monsoon season, and bone dry in the long months that follow it. The far south is temperate, cool, and green in winter, dry and fire-prone in summer. The vast interior is arid, one of the driest landscapes on Earth. A place where the spinifex grass grows in circles that slowly expand outward across the red sand, and the river beds run only a few times in a decade, and the sky is so large and so blue that it can feel like the earth has turned itself inside out. Across all of these landscapes, the first Australians developed relationships with the land that were tuned with extraordinary precision to the specific conditions of specific places. The Aranda people of Central Australia developed a knowledge of the distribution of waterholes so comprehensive and so detailed that it allowed them to survive in one of the harshest environments on this planet, moving between known water sources in a pattern that balanced their need for water against the need to allow the land to recover between visits. The Yolngu people of Arnhem Land developed a detailed knowledge of the tidal patterns and reef systems and seasonal fish movements of the northern coast that sustained them for thousands of years, with a reliability that no outside observer would have predicted from looking at the apparent harshness of their environment. The Yolngu understanding of the sea, of its rhythms and its seasons, of the behavior of specific species in specific locations at specific times of year, was embedded in ceremony and song in ways that made it both reliable across generations and adaptable to the inevitable year-to-year variations in conditions. This is not to romanticize. The life of the first Australians was not a golden age of effortless plenty. It was a life that required constant knowledge, constant skill, constant attentiveness to the signals of the landscape. The price of ignorance in country this demanding was death. The reward for knowledge was life. What this created across 65,000 years was a depth of ecological understanding that has no parallel anywhere in the recorded history of human civilization. Understanding not just of individual species and their behaviors, but of the relationships between species, between weather patterns and vegetation cycles, between fire and renewal, between the movements of the stars and the availability of food on the ground. The practice of fire stick farming, the deliberate and managed burning of vegetation to encourage new growth and to manage the distribution of animals and plants across the landscape, is perhaps the most widely discussed example of this ecological management. Fire, for the first Australians, was not simply a tool for warmth or cooking. It was a land management instrument of considerable sophistication, used to create a mosaic of habitats at different stages of recovery from burning, which maximized biodiversity and food availability across a given landscape. The burning was not random, it was seasonal. It was targeted at specific vegetation types at specific times of year. It was calibrated to the behavior of the animals whose movements the burning was intended to influence. Different communities had different burning regimes suited to different landscapes and different resource mixes. The resulting patchwork of burnt and unburnt vegetation in various stages of recovery created a richness of edge habitats and transitional zones that greatly increased the diversity and abundance of the food resources available. The discontinuation or disruption of traditional burning practices following European colonization has been identified by ecologists as one of the factors contributing to changes in Australian landscapes and to the increased frequency and severity of bushfires. In recent decades, there has been growing recognition of the value of traditional burning knowledge, and in many parts of Australia, Indigenous land managers are working alongside state and national fire authorities to reintroduce traditional burning regimes. The results have been significant enough to shift the conversation about fire management policy substantially. But the fire knowledge is only one thread of a much larger tapestry. The Diabal people of northern Queensland maintain detailed knowledge of the medicinal properties of plants in their rainforest environment. The Nyunga people of southwestern Australia tracked the flowering cycles of dozens of plant species as a calendar, dividing the year into 6 seasons defined by the availability of different foods and the behaviors of different animals, rather than the 4 seasons of the European calendar that reflect the conditions of a very different part of the world. The Anangu people of the Western Desert region maintained knowledge of how to use certain plants to predict rainfall events days in advance. The Warlpiri people of Central Australia had a detailed classification system for soil types and their agricultural properties that modern soil scientists have found to be both accurate and practically useful. Communities across the continent had developed techniques for extracting water from plants and rocks and desert soils in ways that allowed survival in conditions that appear, to unprepared eyes, to offer no water at all. All of this knowledge is both extremely old and, in many communities, still living. In the southeast of the continent, in the high country where the great mountain ash forests grow and the rivers begin their long journeys to the sea, there is a story that has been told by the Kulin peoples for as long as their traditions extend. This story concerns the origins of Port Phillip Bay, the large body of water on the shores of which the city of Melbourne now stands. In the Kulin tradition, there was a time when the bay was not there, when the land stretched out flat and open to where the sea now reaches. There was a time before the water came. Port Phillip Bay was formed approximately 10,000 years ago, when rising sea levels following the end of the last glacial maximum inundated the Yarra River Valley and the surrounding lowlands. At that time, the coastline of what is now Victoria extended considerably further south than it does today, and the land that is now the floor of Port Phillip Bay was occupied and used by the ancestors of the Kulin peoples. The story that remembers this event has been maintained across approximately 400 generations. 400 generations of careful, faithful transmission. The same story, adjusted slightly in the telling for each new generation, but keeping at its core the accurate memory of a geological event that happened 10,000 years ago. There is nothing comparable to this in the written historical record. The oldest written texts from ancient Mesopotamia are approximately 5,000 years old, and the events they describe are at most a few centuries before the time of their composition. The idea that a people might maintain oral traditions that accurately describe geological events from 10,000 years ago was, for most Western scholars, simply inconceivable, because they had no framework within which to evaluate the possibility. What the geological verification of these stories forces upon us is a rethinking of what we mean by history. Western academic tradition has drawn a line between history, which it defines as the period covered by written records, and prehistory, which is everything before that. In this framework, anything beyond 5,000 years ago is, by definition, outside the domain of human historical memory. It happened, but it cannot be remembered. It can only be reconstructed from physical evidence. The oral traditions of the first Australians collapse this distinction. They extend the domain of human memory back 12,000 years and possibly further, not through writing, not through physical objects, but through the living practice of storytelling and song and ceremony. The boundary between history and prehistory, it turns out, is not a natural feature of the world. It is a boundary specific to cultures that rely on writing for knowledge preservation, and it does not apply to cultures that have developed other, equally valid means of carrying the past forward into the present. There is a cluster of enormous granite boulders in the Northern Territory, scattered across a flat plain of red grass and low scrub, as though they have been placed there by a very large and very deliberate hand. These are the Karlu Karlu, known in English as the Devil's Marbles, a name that captures something of their visual strangeness, but misses entirely their cultural and spiritual significance. The boulders, some of which are as large as 6 meters in diameter, are the eroded remnants of a granite intrusion that was laid down approximately 1.7 billion years ago. Over the vast span of time since then, the softer rock surrounding the original intrusion has worn away, leaving the harder granite behind. Differential erosion along the natural joints and fractures of the granite has then rounded the remaining rock into the smooth oval shapes that make the site so visually distinctive. For the Warramungu, Kaitetie, Alyaware and Walpiri peoples, whose country this is, Karlu Karlu is not a geological curiosity. It is a place of deep ceremonial significance associated with dreaming stories that connect the boulders to events in the creation narrative of the landscape. The eggs of the rainbow serpent, the sacred sites of ancestral beings, the resting places of beings whose presence in the land is as real and as present as the wind in the grass. The rainbow serpent is one of the most widespread of all ancestral beings in Australian dreaming traditions. Found in different forms and under different names in the traditions of communities across an enormous geographical range, from Arnhem Land to South Australia, from the Western Desert to the southeast coast. In most traditions, the rainbow serpent is associated with water, with the creation of rivers and waterholes and rain, with fertility and renewal, and the dangerous generative power of the monsoon season. It is one of the oldest religious symbols on earth. Some researchers have speculated that the concept of the rainbow serpent may be connected to the experience of the large pythons that inhabit much of the Australian landscape, creatures of considerable size and power whose sinuous movement through the grass and water may have provided the image around which a much larger mythological concept was built. Others have suggested connections to the rainbow itself, to the arc of light that appears after rain and that has been invested with sacred significance in human cultures across the world. Others still have proposed more complex interpretations that resist simple analogies. What is certain is that the rainbow serpent traditions are very old. Rock art depicting serpentine beings associated with water has been found in Australian sites dated to at least 6,000 years ago, and some researchers believe the tradition reaches back much further. It may be one of the oldest continuously maintained religious concepts on Earth. Let us go to the islands, because the story of the first Australians is not only a story of the continent, and the people of the Torres Strait deserve their place in tonight's account. The Torres Strait is the narrow body of water that separates the northernmost tip of Australia from the southern coast of Papua New Guinea. Within it, there are more than 100 islands, ranging from large vegetated coral cays to small sand and rock outcrops. They are inhabited by the Torres Strait Islander peoples, whose culture is distinct from that of mainland Aboriginal Australians, but equally ancient, equally sophisticated, and equally connected to an intimate and detailed knowledge of the land and sea they have lived on and in for thousands of years. The Torres Strait Islanders are primarily a maritime culture. Their world is the sea as much as the land, and their knowledge of the sea, its currents and tides and reefs and seasonal patterns, is a knowledge developed and refined over thousands of years of continuous engagement with one of the most biologically rich and navigationally complex marine environments on Earth. The canoe traditions of the Torres Strait Islanders were noted by the earliest European visitors as extraordinary. The canoes used for inter-island travel and fishing were sophisticated craft, capable of navigating open water in conditions that would challenge modern sailors. The knowledge required to build them and sail them was maintained and transmitted through the same kinds of ceremonial and practical training that maintained the land-based knowledge of mainland communities. The cosmological traditions of the Torres Strait Islanders are centered on the sea and the sky in ways that reflect their maritime existence. The stars were navigational tools of the first importance. The seasonal patterns of wind and current and fish movement were encoded in ceremony and song. The relationships between different islands, their resources, their dreaming connections, their trade obligations were maintained in a social and ceremonial web that spanned the entire strait. Today, the Torres Strait Islanders face the most immediate and concrete expression of the threat that climate change poses to ancient peoples. The islands are low-lying, and rising sea levels are already affecting the communities that live on them. Some of the smaller islands are at risk of becoming uninhabitable within the lifetime of people alive today. The communities that have lived on these islands for thousands of years are beginning to confront the possibility that the sea, which has been the foundation and the meaning of their world, may also be the force that ends their ability to live there. The irony, given that the oral traditions of the first Australians contain accurate memories of the last time sea levels rose dramatically, is not lost on anyone paying attention. In the desert, in the long night between the last light and the first, when the Milky Way pours itself across the whole arc of the sky and the silence is so deep you can hear your own heartbeat, it is possible to understand something about the relationship between human beings and time that is very difficult to arrive at any other way. The human experience of time is usually small. We live our lives in the span of decades and measure our collective memory in centuries. We speak of ancient history as though 1,000 years ago is remote and almost inaccessible. We design our institutions and our technologies and our economies to operate on timescales of years, occasionally decades. The first Australians have always lived inside a different relationship with time. Their ceremonies connect them to events that happened thousands of generations ago. Their knowledge of the landscape has been tested and refined over timescales that dwarf the entire recorded history of every other civilization. Their stories carry the weight of 10,000 years of direct engagement with the consequences of change, with what happens when the water rises and the land is lost, with what happens when the great animals disappear and the food web shifts, with what happens when the conditions that have sustained a way of life for generations begin to change. This is not abstract knowledge. It is knowledge earned through the most direct and demanding form of experience. The experience of being alive in a place that tests you generation after generation across an almost unimaginable span of time. It is the knowledge of what works and what doesn't work across a longer time span than any other human tradition has ever had the opportunity to test. Let us return, as we always must, to the question of how. How did the most isolated continent on Earth produce the oldest continuous human culture? How did a land cut off from the great flows of influence and exchange that have shaped the rest of human history develop and maintain across 65,000 years, a tradition of knowledge and ceremony and relationship that is in many respects without parallel? Part of the answer, as we have already touched on, is that isolation was not simply a disadvantage. It was also a protection. The cultures that developed in Australia were not competed out of existence by the arrival of more powerful traditions from outside. They were not displaced by agricultural empires or overrun by pastoral nomads or absorbed into conquering states. They were allowed to develop at their own pace to refine their understanding of their specific landscapes over tens of thousands of years, to build the depth of local knowledge that only very long continuity makes possible. But isolation does not by itself explain 65,000 years of cultural continuity. Continuity requires active maintenance. It requires systems for transmitting knowledge reliably across generations. It requires social structures that value the knowledge of the past and invest in its transmission. It requires a philosophy that understands the knowledge of the ancestors as a living inheritance to be protected and passed on, not as a quaint tradition to be superseded by new approaches. The dreaming traditions of the first Australians provided all of these things. They invested the knowledge of the past with sacred authority. They created ceremonial obligations that made the transmission of knowledge both a social duty and a spiritual practice. They built the knowledge into the landscape itself, encoding it in sites and songs and ceremonies that required active engagement with the physical world in order to be properly performed. And they did something else that is perhaps the most fundamental thing of all. They created a philosophy of time in which the past and the present and the future are not separate but continuous, in which the ancestors are not gone but present, in which the actions taken now are continuous with the actions taken in the time of creation, in which the responsibility to the land and to the community and to the larger order of things is not a burden to be managed, but the deepest expression of what it means to be alive and human and connected. This is a philosophy that has sustained the oldest continuous human culture on Earth across 65,000 years of change. It is a philosophy that was developed not in a library, not in a university, not in the councils of a state, but in the direct and daily engagement with the land that required everything of the people who lived on it and gave everything in return. Somewhere in the process of spending time with this story, a question tends to arise. It is a question that feels almost impolite to ask, but it is one worth sitting with rather than pushing away. If the first Australians developed such a sophisticated and sustainable culture over such an extraordinary span of time, what does that say about what happened after 1788? It says something that is not comfortable to hear, but that the evidence makes unavoidable. The arrival of European colonization in Australia was, for the first Australians, a catastrophe. The precise population of the continent at the time of first European contact is debated, with estimates ranging from 300,000 to well over 1 million people. Within 100 years of European settlement, the population had been reduced by somewhere between 75 and 90% through a combination of introduced diseases, dispossession from traditional lands, massacres, forced removal, and the deliberate and systematic dismantling of the cultural practices and family structures through which Aboriginal identity and knowledge were transmitted. The songlines were disrupted, the ceremonies were banned, the children were taken, the languages were suppressed. The relationship between communities and their country, the relationship that was the foundation of everything, was severed by force. What was lost in this process is impossible to fully quantify, because the measure of it includes not just lives, but knowledge. And not just knowledge, but the accumulated understanding of 65,000 years of careful, sustained attention to a place. Some of it was preserved, much was lost. The process of recovery and reclamation that has been underway in Aboriginal communities across Australia for the past several decades is one of the most significant and important cultural projects occurring anywhere in the world, and it is being conducted against enormous odds and with remarkable resilience. The Gunditjmara people, whose eel traps at Budj Bim are now a World Heritage Site, fought for 50 years for formal recognition of their native title and their connection to their country. That recognition came in 2007. The process of rebuilding the language, the ceremony, the knowledge that was disrupted by colonization is ongoing, it is slow, and it is not complete, and it will never recover everything that was lost, but it is real. Similarly, across the continent, communities are working to document and revitalize languages, to pass on the knowledge of country to younger generations, to re-establish the ceremonial practices and the relationships with land that give the culture its continuity. The number of Aboriginal languages being actively taught and learned is growing. The number of people identifying as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander is growing. The body of research acknowledging the sophistication and value of traditional Aboriginal knowledge systems is growing. None of this reverses the catastrophe, but it is evidence of a resilience that, given the depth of what was survived, says something profound about the culture that survived it. In the red desert of the Northern Territory, far from any city, on the edge of the country that the Anangu people have managed and known for tens of thousands of years, there is a rock formation so large and so strange and so beautiful that it seems when you see it for the first time like something that should not exist. Uluru, Katachuta. These are not just landmarks, they are not just geological curiosities. They are places where the dreaming is present with unusual intensity, where the ancestral beings who shaped the world moved and acted with particular significance, where the stories of creation and law and relationship are inscribed not just in the oral tradition, but in the rock itself, in the shapes and the colors and the caves and the waterholes of the formation. The Anangu people have been the custodians of Uluru Katachuta for more than 10,000 years. Their knowledge of the site is both geological and ceremonial, both practical and cosmological. They know the water holes that are reliable even in drought. They know the plants that grow in the seasonal niches around the base of the rock and what they are good for. They know the stories that explain how the rock came to be in its current form. And those stories are not separate from the geological understanding, but are, in a different language and a different framework, a way of describing real events that shape the landscape. Uluru itself is one of the most recognizable natural formations on Earth. The sheer scale of it, rising almost 350 meters above the surrounding plain in a single unbroken curve of sandstone, is something that photographs consistently fail to convey. You have to stand at the base of it, which is approximately 9.5 kilometers in circumference, to begin to understand the actual dimensions of the thing. It is not a hill, it is a presence. The colors of Uluru change across the day and across the seasons in ways that are deeply affecting. At dawn, the rock is a deep, burning orange that shades through crimson into the pale gold of morning. At sunset, it reverses the sequence, running from gold through orange into a purple that seems, in the last minutes before dark, almost violet. These color changes are not just aesthetically beautiful. They are, in the Anangu understanding, a kind of presence, a manifestation of the life of the country, and they have their own ceremonial significance. In October 2019, after decades of debate and advocacy, the Australian government formally closed Uluru to climbers. This was not a restriction imposed from outside. It was the fulfillment of a request that the Anangu had been making respectfully and consistently since the 1980s, when they were formally granted title to their country. Their objection to climbing was not simply a matter of offense or cultural sensitivity. It was a statement about what the rock is and what the appropriate relationship between human beings and a site of that kind is. It was a statement consistent with a philosophy of custodianship and responsibility that has guided their management of that country for longer than most civilizations have existed. The closure of Uluru to climbing was, in its way, a small but significant acknowledgement by the broader Australian society that the knowledge and the values of the first Australians have something to offer to the question of how to be in this country. There is a broader story that tonight's account is embedded in, and it is worth stepping back to see its full shape before we come to the close. The standard story of human progress, as it has been told for most of the history of Western academic thought, is a story of increasing complexity, increasing knowledge, increasing technological capacity, increasing control over the natural world. In this story, more complex societies are in some sense more advanced than simpler ones. And the societies that developed writing and metallurgy and intensive agriculture and urban civilization are understood as having progressed further along this arc of development than those that did not. The story of the first Australians complicates this narrative in ways that are very difficult to dismiss. Here is a culture that maintained its fundamental continuity across a span of time that dwarfs every other human civilization on record. Here is a culture that developed knowledge systems of genuine sophistication, systems that allowed it to manage and sustain some of the most demanding environments on Earth over tens of thousands of years. Here is a culture that maintained accurate historical memory across 12,000 years, that developed astronomical knowledge precise enough to track the solstices and equinoxes, that built engineered aquaculture infrastructure older than Stonehenge, that generated the world's largest collection of ancient rock art. And that did all of this while remaining in what most Western historical frameworks would describe as the Stone Age. What does that mean? It might mean that the criteria by which we assess the sophistication and value of human cultures need to be broader than they have been. It might mean that complexity and knowledge can take forms that are not immediately legible to observers from different traditions. It might mean that the relationship between technological complexity and cultural richness is more complicated than the standard narrative suggests. It might also mean that some of the things that Western civilization has treated as marks of progress, intensive agriculture, urbanization, the separation of human communities from the land they inhabit, the conversion of the natural world into a resource to be exploited, are not unambiguously progressive at all, that they carry costs as well as benefits, and that the benefits have been unevenly distributed in ways that are only now becoming fully visible. The oldest living culture on Earth has always known this. It has known it not as an abstraction, not as a critique made from outside looking in, but as a lived reality, tested and refined across 65,000 years of engagement, with the consequences of both getting it right and getting it wrong. The ecological costs of the agricultural revolution are now well documented. The degradation of soils by intensive cultivation, the collapse of biodiversity in heavily farmed landscapes, the vulnerability of populations that depend on a small number of crop species to the failure of those species, the pollution of waterways and the depletion of aquifers. These are not hypothetical concerns. They are the demonstrated outcomes of an approach to the land that treats it as a resource to be maximized rather than a relationship to be maintained. The approach to the land embodied in the traditions of the first Australians is different in ways that are now being studied and applied by ecologists and land managers around the world. Not as a romantic ideal to be copied wholesale, but as a source of practical knowledge and philosophical perspective that has something genuinely valuable to offer to the project of working out how to live sustainably on this earth. There is a concept in many Aboriginal Australian languages that does not translate neatly into English. The word used most often in discussions across language barriers is country. Not country in the sense of a nation state, and not country in the sense of the rural landscape as opposed to the city. Country in the Aboriginal sense is something more fundamental and more personal than either of those. Country is a specific place and everything that place contains. It is the rocks and the soil and the water and the wind. It is the animals and the plants. It is the dreaming connections that link the place to the wider network of sacred sites and songlines. It is the relationships between the human beings who belong to that country, whose identity is formed by it and bound to it in ways that are both spiritual and practical. It is the obligations that country places on the people who belong to it, to know it, to care for it, to speak for it when it needs speaking for, To belong to country is not the same as owning it. The relationship is in many ways the reverse. Country holds the people as much as the people hold the country. The people are part of the country, one of its many living components, with particular responsibilities toward the whole. The well-being of the people and the well-being of the country are not separate things. They rise and fall together. This concept is foreign to most Western thinking about land, which has been dominated for centuries by the framework of property, by the idea that land is a resource that can be owned, bought, sold, and exploited by whoever holds legal title to it. In the property framework, land has value in proportion to what can be extracted from it. The relationship between the owner and the land is fundamentally one of exploitation, modified only by whatever legal or ethical constraints the owner chooses to observe or is compelled to accept. The country framework inverts this. In the country framework, the primary relationship is one of responsibility. The land is not valued for what can be extracted from it, but for what it is in itself. The human beings who belong to it are its custodians, not its owners. Their obligations to it precede and supersede their rights over it. This is not just a philosophical difference. It has practical consequences for how landscapes are managed and what their condition looks like over long periods of time. The landscapes of Australia at the time of European contact were, by multiple lines of evidence, in better ecological condition than they had been under the management of the first Australians, than they became after European settlement introduced the property framework and the land management practices that accompanied it. This is not an idealized picture. The first Australians were not ecologically perfect. They hunted animals to extinction, though this is disputed and the evidence is complex. They changed their landscapes, sometimes in ways that had lasting consequences, but across 65,000 years of occupation, they maintained the productivity and biological diversity of the Australian continent in a way that agricultural civilization has, in 230 years, demonstrably failed to match. On the sandstone platforms of Sydney Harbour, in the gaps between the development and the roads and the houses that now cover most of the rock, there are engravings. Not many people know they are there. They are easy to miss if you do not know what you're looking for, and they have not been given the prominence that their age and significance deserve. But they are there, cut into the smooth sandstone by the ancestors of the Cadigal, Gayame and other Eora peoples, depicting the animals and ancestral beings of the Sydney coastal country in clean, confident lines that have survived on exposed rock faces for thousands of years. These engravings are part of a tradition of rock art along the coastal sandstone belt of New South Wales that extends for hundreds of kilometres, from the Hawkesbury River in the north to well south of Sydney. And that includes thousands of individual sites with tens of thousands of individual figures: whales, dolphins, sharks, emus, kangaroos, echidnas, human figures in postures that suggest ceremony, fish of species that are still found in the harbour. The Sydney rock engravings have been less studied than many other Australian rock art sites, partly because of the difficulty of dating them, and partly because of the challenges posed by their location within a densely settled urban environment. But the engravings that have been examined in detail are consistent with a long tradition of artistic and ceremonial activity that began long before European settlement and continued right up to the point of contact. There is something quietly extraordinary about knowing that beneath the streets and suburbs of one of the largest cities in the Southern Hemisphere, On the rock shelves at the edge of its famous harbor, there are images made by hands that worked in the same spirit and with the same intention as the artists of Majid Bebe and Murujuga and Kakadu, that the oldest continuous artistic tradition on Earth was still alive and active in this harbor when the first fleet arrived in 1788, that it was here and is still here in the fragments that survived the building over and the wearing away, in the knowledge held by the Yora peoples whose country this has always been. There is a conversation happening in Australia today that would have been very difficult to have 50 years ago, and that is only beginning to reach the mainstream in some quarters. It is a conversation about what Australian history actually is and how long it actually extends and what it means for the present. The history taught in Australian schools for most of the 20th century began, effectively, in 1788. It began with the arrival of the First Fleet, with the establishment of the colony at Sydney Cove, with the figures of Arthur Phillip and Lachlan Macquarie, and the other colonial administrators whose names are still on the roads and suburbs of Australian cities. The 65,000 years that preceded 1788 were treated, when they were treated at all, as background, as the context for the story of European settlement, not as history in their own right. This framing is now finally beginning to change. There is growing recognition that the history of Australia does not begin in 1788. It begins, at minimum, 65,000 years ago, on the shores of an ancient landscape that the first arrivals encountered not as empty terra nullius, but as a fully inhabited and actively managed world. The story of Australia includes the dreaming traditions and the songlines and the eel traps and the rock art and the astronomical observations and the 10,000-year oral memories of rising seas. It includes all of that because all of that happened here in this land, and the people who created it are still here. There are young Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander historians, archaeologists, linguists, and cultural practitioners who are doing extraordinary work to recover, preserve, and communicate this history on their own terms, not as objects of anthropological study, but as the authors and custodians of their own traditions. There are collaborations between traditional knowledge holders and scientists that are producing new insights into both the specific histories of particular places and the broader question of what human beings are capable of sustaining over long periods of time. And there is, slowly, a broader acknowledgement within Australian society that this history matters, that understanding it properly, treating it with the seriousness it deserves, is not just a matter of fairness to the first Australians, though it is certainly that. It is a matter of understanding where this land has come from and what it has been through, and what knowledge it carries that might be relevant to the questions that face everyone who lives here now. There is one more thing worth considering before the night grows fully quiet. The question this documentary set out to answer was how the world's most isolated continent built the world's oldest sites. And the answer that has emerged over the course of the last 2 hours is not a simple one, but it has a shape. It is not that isolation produced the oldest culture by giving it room to develop without interference, though that is part of it. It is not that the land demanded a particular quality of attention that produced the depth of knowledge we have been exploring, though that is part of it too. It is not even that the ceremonial and philosophical traditions of the first Australians were simply better designed for long-term continuity than other traditions, though the evidence suggests that they were. The deeper answer is something about the relationship between a people and a place across a span of time long enough for that relationship to become not just knowledge but identity. Long enough for the land to be not just where you live but who you are. Long enough for the accumulated understanding of generations to become not a curriculum to be learned, but a birthright to be carried. The oldest sites in Australia are old not because they were built to last, but because the people who made them never left. The rock shelters of Majid Bebe are old because the Mirar people and the peoples who came before them were there 65,000 years ago and have been there in an unbroken thread of presence ever since. The petroglyphs of Murujuga are old because the traditional owners of that country were there when the first marks were made and have been there, caring for those marks, understanding what they mean, passing that understanding on across an unimaginable span of time. The oldest sites in the world's most isolated continent are the sites they are because the oldest continuous culture on Earth never left them. And that, as much as anything else that has been said tonight, is the answer. There is one place in Australia that perhaps more than any other holds the full complexity of what we have been exploring tonight, where the ancient and the present exist in such close proximity that the distance between them collapses entirely, where you can stand on a single piece of ground and feel the weight of time in a way that is almost physical. That place is on the edge of the Nullarbor Plain, in the far south of the continent, where the limestone plateau runs straight and flat to the edge of the Southern Ocean, and the cliffs drop down to the water in near vertical faces of pale rock. The Nullarbor. The name is from the Latin for no tree, and it is accurate. The plain extends across thousands of square kilometres of southern Australia, with barely a shrub tall enough to cast meaningful shade. It is one of the largest single limestone karst plateaus in the world, formed from the sediment of an ancient sea that covered this region millions of years ago. Beneath the surface of the Nullarbor, accessible through a series of sinkholes and cave entrances scattered across the plain, there is a world that has been sealed from the surface for thousands of years. The caves of the Nullarbor extend for extraordinary distances, some of them containing underground lakes of extraordinary stillness, water that has not been in contact with the outside atmosphere for millennia. In some of these caves, archaeologists have found the remains of megafauna, preserved in extraordinary condition by the cold, dry, stable conditions deep underground. Animals that walked on the surface of the Nullarbor tens of thousands of years ago fell through the sinkholes and were preserved in the darkness below, complete skeletons of creatures that have no living counterparts, resting in chambers that no human eyes saw for thousands of years. The Mirning people are the traditional custodians of the Nullarbor. Their country spans the most remote and apparently inhospitable stretch of the southern Australian coast, the place where European explorers consistently reported that nothing could live and nobody would choose to be. And yet the Mirning have been there, managing their country with the same depth of knowledge and commitment that Aboriginal peoples everywhere in Australia have brought to their landscapes for tens of thousands of years. The whale dreaming of the Mirning people is one of the most powerful and beautiful of the many dreaming traditions associated with the southern coast. In the Mirning tradition, the great whales that move through the Southern Ocean are not simply animals. They are kin. They are ancestral beings connected to the people of the coast in relationships of deep reciprocity and mutual obligation. The Murning have maintained this relationship across the entire span of their occupation of this country, watching the whales pass along the cliff edge each year, knowing them by their patterns of behavior, understanding their movements as part of the same larger order of things that governs everything else in the landscape. The southern right whales that breed in the bays along the edge of the Great Australian Bight were hunted almost to extinction in the 19th century by commercial whalers operating in these waters. Their population has been slowly recovering since commercial whaling ended, and the Head of Bight, a bay in the eastern section of the Murning country, is now one of the best places on Earth to observe southern right whales at close range during their breeding season. The whales come into the sheltered waters of the bay to give birth and nurse their calves, completely unperturbed by human observers on the cliffs above. There is something in that scene, the ancient whales in the ancient bay beneath the ancient cliffs, with the oldest continuously inhabited continent stretched out behind them, that carries a kind of significance beyond the merely picturesque. Let us speak about language for a moment, because the linguistic story of Australia is itself one of the most remarkable aspects of the first Australian story, and it is one that is rarely discussed with the depth it deserves. At the time of European contact in 1788, the Australian continent was home to somewhere between 200 and 300 distinct language groups. Not dialects of a single language, but separate languages, as different from each other in many cases as French is from Japanese, each with its own grammar, its own vocabulary, its own way of categorizing and describing the world. This linguistic diversity is, in itself, a record of deep time. Languages diversify slowly. For there to be 200 distinct languages across a single continent, there must have been a process of language divergence operating over an extremely long period of time as communities became geographically separated and developed distinct linguistic traditions. The linguistic diversity of Australia at European contact is consistent with and provides independent support for the archaeological evidence of deep, continuous occupation. But the languages of Australia are not simply diverse in the sense of being numerous. They are diverse in the sense of being structurally unusual in ways that are deeply interesting to linguists. Many Australian languages have features that are rare or absent in languages found elsewhere in the world. Complex systems of case marking that allow very free word order. Elaborate systems of kinship terminology that reflect and reinforce the social structures of the communities using them. Sound systems that include sounds not found in most other language families. Grammatical features that encode information about spatial relationships, social obligations, and sacred knowledge in ways that have no equivalents in the languages of Europe or Asia. The loss of Aboriginal languages under the impact of colonization has been catastrophic. Of the approximately 250 languages spoken in 1788, only approximately 120 are still spoken today. Of those, the vast majority are spoken by only a small number of elderly speakers and face severe risk of extinction within the next generation. About 13 languages are considered relatively secure, with enough speakers of all age groups to make their continued transmission likely. What is lost when a language is lost is not simply a set of words that could theoretically be replaced by equivalent words in another language. What is lost is a way of categorizing and understanding the world, a set of distinctions and connections and relationships that the language embeds in the minds of its speakers, a unique angle of view on the shared reality of being alive in a particular place at a particular time. The Australian languages that have been studied in detail contain, in their structures and their vocabularies, encodings of knowledge about the Australian landscape and its living systems that have no equivalents in English. Knowledge about the relationships between species that are encoded in the names by which those species are known. Knowledge about the behavior of weather that is encoded in the way the language describes the sky and the wind. Knowledge about the properties of plants that is embedded in the names by which those plants are identified. When these languages fall silent, that knowledge becomes inaccessible in a way that no amount of translation can fully remedy. The language is not just a vehicle for the knowledge. In many cases, the language is the knowledge, encoded in its deepest structure. The work of language revival being done in Aboriginal communities across Australia is therefore not merely a matter of cultural pride, though it is certainly that. It is a matter of preserving access to knowledge systems that may contain information and ways of understanding the world that have no equivalent in any other form. There is a mountain, or what passes for a mountain in the flat ancient heartland of Australia, that rises above the red plain of the Flinders Ranges in South Australia, with a presence that feels entirely disproportionate to its actual elevation. This is Wilpenna Pound, or Ikara in the Adnyamathanha language, a natural amphitheater formed by the collision of ancient mountain ridges into a roughly circular formation, roughly 8 kilometers wide and 16 kilometers long, enclosing a relatively flat inner plain at a higher elevation than the surrounding country. The Adnyamathanha people, whose name means hills people, have been the custodians of this country since long before the geological formation had a European name. Their dreaming stories explain the formation of Pound in terms of the actions of two great Akura, serpentine ancestral beings, who came together here and whose coiling bodies formed the ridges that now enclose the valley. The dreaming story is, like so many dreaming stories, simultaneously a cosmological statement and a description of physical reality. Encoding in mythological form the observable fact that the ridges form a circular pattern suggestive of coiled bodies. The Flinders Ranges have been inhabited for at least 49,000 years, according to the archaeological evidence from sites in the region, making them one of the oldest continuously inhabited areas in Australia's interior. The rock art of the region is extensive and spans many styles and periods, from the simple geometric markings of the earliest occupation to the more complex figurative and symbolic art of later periods. The Adnyamathanha maintain a body of ecological knowledge about the Flinders Ranges environment that has been developed and refined over their entire period of occupation. Knowledge of the plants that can be used for food and medicine. Knowledge of the water sources that remain reliable in drought. Knowledge of the patterns of rainfall and temperature that govern the availability of different food resources across the year. Knowledge of the animals, their behaviors, their seasonal movements, the signs that indicate their presence in a particular area. Much of this knowledge is encoded in the dreaming stories of the region, stories that connect specific landscape features to specific ancestral events and that embed practical ecological information within a ceremonial and cosmological framework that makes it both memorable and sacred. A story that explains why a particular waterhole is dangerous to drink from in summer is not just a practical warning, it is a story about the ancestral being whose presence makes the waterhole dangerous. a story that connects the practical knowledge to the larger framework of the dreaming and that invests the warning with the authority of sacred law. This is one of the great insights embedded in the dreaming tradition as a knowledge system. By investing practical knowledge with sacred significance, it makes the transmission of that knowledge a matter of ritual obligation rather than simply educational choice. The knowledge is passed on because passing it on is a sacred duty, because failure to do so would be a failure of responsibility to the ancestors and to the country itself. This is a far more powerful mechanism for ensuring reliable transmission than any system based on individual motivation alone. The question of what the first Australians knew about the world beyond their continent is a fascinating and still incompletely answered one. For most of the period of Aboriginal occupation of Australia, the continent was more connected to the rest of the world than it is now. During the periods of low sea level associated with the various glacial maxima of the Pleistocene epoch, the land bridge between Australia and New Guinea existed as a continuous strip of land, making what is now the Torres Strait a terrestrial corridor through which people and ideas and animals could move relatively freely. The island chains of what is now Indonesia extended further south and east than they do today, and the sea crossings between them and the Australian mainland were shorter. During these periods, there was certainly movement between Australia and the neighbouring regions. The dingo, the wild dog of Australia, is believed to have arrived on the continent from Southeast Asia approximately 4,000 years ago, brought by people who arrived by sea. Its introduction suggests that contact between Australia and Southeast Asia was not a one-time event at the beginning of occupation, but continued at various intensities across much of the history of occupation. There are also references in oral traditions of communities in Arnhem Land and other parts of northern Australia to the Macassan traders, seafarers from what is now the Indonesian island of Sulawesi, who visited the northern Australian coast annually for several centuries before European contact, trading for sea cucumber known as trepang, which was a valuable commodity in Chinese markets. The Macassan visits, which probably began sometime around the 16th or 17th century, left lasting traces in the oral traditions, the material culture, the genetics, and even the vocabulary of the Aboriginal communities of the north. Words of Macassan origin entered several northern Australian languages. Boat designs influenced the watercraft of some northern communities. The practice of smoking tobacco was adopted from the Macassans and spread inland along trade networks. Genetic studies have confirmed the presence of Southeast Asian ancestry in some Aboriginal Australian populations, consistent with the historical record of the Macassan contact. What this tells us is that the first Australians were not simply passive occupants of a sealed continent. They were active participants in a regional world that extended well beyond their own coastlines. They maintained relationships with visitors and trading partners, absorbed useful knowledge and material from those relationships, and integrated the new with the old in ways that preserved the continuity of their own traditions while remaining open to what was genuinely useful from outside. This is a picture of a culture that was both deeply conservative in the sense of placing enormous value on the preservation of inherited knowledge and genuinely adaptive, capable of incorporating new knowledge and new relationships without losing the essential character of its own tradition. That combination of conservation and adaptability is, when you think about it, exactly what a culture needs to survive 65,000 years. Deep in the Victoria River district of the Northern Territory, in country of extraordinary beauty and complexity, there is a series of rock art sites that contain one of the most remarkable and least known artistic traditions in the world. This is the country of the Ngarinman, Karangpuru, Jaminjong, and other peoples, and the art they and their ancestors have made on the rock faces here spans a period of continuous creation that extends back to the earliest phases of human occupation in this part of Australia. The Bradshaw-style figures of the Kimberley have their own distinctive character, but the art of the Victoria River region has a different quality, one that combines dynamic human figures with elaborate geometric designs in ways that suggest both ceremonial purpose and a sophisticated artistic sensibility operating at a considerable remove from anything produced in the Western tradition. What is striking about much of this art, when you see it in photographs or read the descriptions of those who have visited the sites, is its confidence. These are not hesitant marks made by people unsure of what they are doing or why. They are the marks of a tradition so well established, so deeply practiced, so thoroughly understood by its practitioners, that even the most complex compositions appear to have been executed with complete assurance. The artists knew what they were making and why they were making it. They were working within a tradition of enormous depth and power, and that tradition is visible in every line. The tradition of making this art was not decorative in any trivial sense. It was ceremonial. The making of the marks was itself an act of ritual significance, a way of engaging with the dreaming, of maintaining the connection between the present community and the ancestral past, of fulfilling the obligations that the country and its stories placed on the people who belong to them. The finished images were not simply pictures, they were presences. They were the result of an encounter between the artist and the ancestral world, and they carried some of the power of that encounter in their physical form. This understanding of art as encounter, as an active engagement with the sacred dimension of reality, rather than simply the production of a pleasing or useful object, has parallels in the artistic traditions of many cultures, but nowhere else has it been maintained with such consistency across such an extraordinary span of time. Somewhere in the southeast of the continent, in the place where the Great Dividing Range begins to lose altitude and the rivers spread out across the broad plains on their way to the Murray-Darling system, there are trees, specific trees, marked in ways that identify them immediately as special, as set apart from the ordinary trees of the forest. These are the scarred trees, the canoe trees and burial trees of the Aboriginal peoples of southeastern Australia. A canoe tree is a living tree from which a large section of bark has been carefully removed, the bark shaped into the hull of a canoe while still pliable from the warmth of the living tree, leaving a distinctive scar in the trunk that, over decades and centuries, the tree has grown around and partially healed in ways that make the origin of the scar unmistakable. Many of these trees are very old, their scars centuries in the making, their trunks still living and growing despite the ancient wound. There are thousands of scarred trees across southeastern Australia, in places ranging from national parks and state forests to paddocks and road verges and the backyards of suburban houses. Many have been destroyed by clearing and development. Many survive in places where nobody has taken the time to notice what they are. Some have been formally protected as Aboriginal heritage sites, but the ones that survive are extraordinary in their quiet testimony. a tree whose bark was removed 300 years ago to make a canoe in which someone paddled down a river that still flows past the same spot. The living wood of the wound, still growing, still bearing leaves, still part of the forest, carrying within its cells the physical record of an act of practical skill in everyday life from the deep Aboriginal past. The burial trees are different in character but equally moving. In some traditions of southeastern Australia, the bodies of the dead were placed in the hollows of large trees or in platforms built in their branches, and the tree was then scarred with ceremonial markings that identified it as a burial site and invested it with the spiritual significance of containing the remains of the ancestors. Some of these trees still stand in the forests of Victoria and New South Wales and southern Queensland, their ancient scars still visible, their significance still recognised by the communities whose ancestors rest within them. These trees are not just historical monuments, they are still understood by the communities to which they belong as places of presence, as sites where the relationship between the living and the ancestral past is tangible and real. They are part of the living landscape of relationship that constitutes country, and they are managed and protected with the same sense of obligation that governs the management of every other sacred site. In the late afternoon light of an Australian summer, when the heat has begun to ease and the long shadows of the eucalypts stretch across the red earth, and the birds have started to move again after the silence of the midday heat, there is a quality of stillness in the Australian landscape that is quite unlike anything found in other parts of the world. It is a stillness that feels very old. Older than the afternoon, older than the season, as old perhaps as the land itself, which has been this old and this still for longer than the mind can comfortably hold. People who have spent long periods in the Australian bush, who have learned to move quietly in it and to pay attention to what it is telling them at any given moment, often describe an experience of the landscape as a kind of presence. Not a presence in any mystical or supernatural sense necessarily, though for many Aboriginal Australians it is understood in exactly those terms, simply a quality of attentiveness in the land itself, a sense that this place is aware of you in some way that you cannot fully explain. This is perhaps simply what it feels like to be in a landscape that has been attended to by human beings for 65,000 years. A landscape that has been observed and named and sung and cared for across such an enormous span of time that the accumulated attention of all those generations has become, in some sense, part of what the place is. A landscape in which you are not the first person ever to have noticed that quality of late afternoon light, or to have felt that stillness, or to have paused for a moment and tried to understand what this place is trying to tell you. You are instead the latest in an unbroken line of people stretching back 65,000 years who have stood in approximately this kind of light, in approximately this kind of landscape, and felt approximately this kind of thing. That is a strange and humbling position to be in. It is also, in a way that is difficult to articulate, a kind of consolation. There is a practical dimension to the depth of Aboriginal Australian knowledge that is only now beginning to be fully appreciated outside of Australia, and that has significant implications for how we think about the management of natural environments more broadly. In the Cape York Peninsula, in the far northeast of Queensland, researchers working with the traditional owners of the rainforest country have documented a system of land management that maintained the health and productivity of one of the most complex and biodiversity-rich ecosystems in Australia across thousands of years. The rainforests of Cape York are ancient, their origins reaching back to the Great Gondwanan forests of the Cretaceous period, and their ecology is correspondingly complex, with relationships between species so deeply embedded that disturbing any one of them sends ripples through the whole system. The Aboriginal land management of this country involved controlled burning at the edges of the rainforest, maintenance of specific plant species through selective harvesting, management of animal populations through hunting, and protection of breeding areas, and a complex system of seasonal movement and resource use that distributed pressure across the landscape in ways that prevented any single area from being depleted. All of this was encoded in knowledge systems that were maintained through ceremony and song and practical training across many generations. The knowledge was not held in any single place or by any single person. It was distributed across the community and across the landscape, redundant in exactly the ways that a well-designed information system should be. When this system of management was disrupted, first by the introduction of new diseases that killed much of the population, then by forced removal of communities from their country, then by the introduction of cattle and other feral animals that disrupted the ecology in ways that traditional burning patterns could not address, the condition of the Cape York landscape changed significantly. Areas that had been managed as productive and diverse mosaics of habitat began to degrade. Feral pigs rooted up the rainforest floor. Cats and foxes preyed on native animals that had no evolutionary experience of them. Weeds introduced from other parts of the world spread through the disturbed areas. The process of restoring country, which is now underway in many parts of Cape York, under the leadership of traditional owners working with support from state and federal agencies, involves not just the removal of feral animals and weeds, but the reintroduction of traditional burning regimes and the knowledge required to conduct them effectively. Knowledge held by elders who learned it from their parents and grandparents is being documented and transmitted to younger generations who will be responsible for carrying it forward. It is, in a very literal sense, the reactivation of a knowledge system that was interrupted and that is now being restored. A system developed and refined across thousands of years to maintain the health and productivity of a specific and irreplaceable landscape, being brought back online painstakingly by the people whose ancestors built it. In the high country of New South Wales, where the snow gums cling to rocky slopes above the tree line, and the streams run clean and cold between mossy banks, there is another set of sites that carries its own particular weight of time, the bogong moth. Every year, in late spring, vast numbers of the large brown bogong moth migrate from their breeding grounds in the lowlands to the high country, where they estivate through the summer in the cool crevices of the granite tors and rock faces. For the Aboriginal peoples of the high country, this annual arrival of the moths was one of the most significant events of the year. A rich, nutritious food source arriving in enormous, concentrated quantities at a predictable time and place. Communities from a wide area, the Ngarigo, Wolgal, Monero and other peoples, would travel to the high country for the moth season, harvesting the moths from their resting places, roasting them on coals, and either eating them fresh or processing them into a rich, fatty food that could be stored and carried. The bogong moth gatherings were not just food procurement events. They were social occasions of the first importance. Communities whose territories did not normally overlap met here each year, in the neutral and abundant space of the high country, for ceremony, trade, the resolution of disputes, the arrangement of marriages, and the transmission of knowledge across the wider network. The Bogong moth season was, in other words, a great annual congress of the peoples of southeastern Australia, held in one of the most beautiful and climatically benign environments in the continent, sustained by a food source of extraordinary reliability and richness. Archaeological evidence of the Bogong moth gatherings dates back at least 3,000 years, and some researchers believe the practice extends much further. The caves and rock shelters of the high country that served as bases for the moth harvesting parties are rich in material evidence of their repeated use, layer upon layer of hearths and food remains, and discarded stone tools that speak of many generations of annual return. The Bogong moth seasons were also occasions for ceremony of a specifically high country character, ceremonies connected to the landscape of the snowfields and the granite peaks that were not conducted elsewhere. This is a significant point. The ceremonial traditions of the first Australians were not uniform across the continent. They were as specific and as diverse as the landscapes that gave rise to them. Each region had its own ceremonial life, its own dreaming stories connected to its own specific landscape features, its own seasonal calendar of sacred events tied to the particular ecology of that country. And yet all of these diverse regional traditions were connected through the songlines and the trade networks and the ceremonial occasions like the Bogong moth gathering, into a larger whole that gave the continent a degree of cultural coherence, even across its enormous diversity. There is a word that appears regularly in discussions of Aboriginal Australian philosophy and governance, a word that is both simple and, on reflection, quite profound. The word is law. Not law in the Western sense of codified rules enforced by state power, but law in the sense of accumulated wisdom, received knowledge, the inherited understanding of how things are and how people should be. The law of the first Australians was not written down, but it was not arbitrary or vague. It was specific and detailed and demanding. It governed the relationships between people of different kinship categories, specifying who could marry whom, who owed obligations to whom, who could speak in which ceremonial contexts, who was responsible for the management of which parts of the country. It governed the use of natural resources, specifying when and how and in what quantities different species could be harvested, and where and when harvesting was prohibited. It governed the conduct of ceremonies, specifying who could attend, who could participate, what could be said and sung and shown, and what had to be kept restricted to those with the appropriate standing and knowledge. This is a system of social and environmental governance of considerable complexity and sophistication, and it was enforced not by police or courts or prisons, but by the collective authority of the community, by the weight of tradition, and by the spiritual sanction of the dreaming, which invested the law with an authority that transcended any individual or any generation. The effectiveness of this system of governance in maintaining both social cohesion and environmental sustainability across 65,000 years speaks for itself. No other governance system in human history can claim anything close to this record of sustained success. This is not to suggest that the system was without conflict or without failure. Human communities everywhere have conflicts, and the Aboriginal Australian communities were no exception. There were disputes over country, over resources, over ceremonial obligations. There were feuds and battles and the kinds of violence that seemed to be an ineradicable part of human social life. But these conflicts were managed within a framework of law and ceremony that provided mechanisms for resolution, and that maintained the overall continuity of the social and environmental system across the inevitable ups and downs of any human community's history. The stars above Australia on a clear night are extraordinary. But before we come to the stars and the close of tonight's journey, there are a few more places we should visit, a few more threads we should follow to the end of what they have to tell us. In the far north of Queensland, on the Cape York Peninsula, where the land tapers toward its meeting with the Torres Strait, there is a cave system called Quincan. The Quincan rock art sites, named for the spirit beings depicted in many of the paintings, are among the richest and most significant rock art sites in Australia, and by extension among the most significant in the world. The name Quincan refers to a class of ancestral spirit beings depicted in the rock art of the region, beings of distinctive and often unsettling form, with elongated limbs and large eyes and postures that suggest a capacity for sudden and unexpected movement. There are two main types of Quincan in the rock art tradition of the region, the Timara and the Imjim, each with distinct visual characteristics and distinct roles in the ceremonial and philosophical understanding of the Kukuthaipan and other peoples whose country this is. The Quincan sites are significant not just for the age and quality of the art, but for the extraordinary range of species depicted. Kangaroos and wallabies and emus and crocodiles and fish and freshwater turtles and snakes and lizards are all represented with the vividness and precision that speak of long and careful observation of the animals being depicted. The artists who made these paintings knew these animals intimately, knew their characteristic postures and movements and the ways in which they held themselves when at rest and when startled. Some of the species depicted are no longer found in the Cape York region and have not been found there for a very long time. The thylacine appears in the Quincan galleries, as it appears in rock art at sites across the continent. Its distinctive striped body and unusual gait captured in images that preserve the visual record of an animal that mainland Australia lost thousands of years ago. The age of the Quincan galleries is not fully established, but the site has been continuously used for art making for at least 4,000 years, with earlier layers of art potentially extending the record much further. The youngest paintings are relatively recent, made within historical memory, showing horses and cattle and other animals introduced by Europeans, created in the same tradition and on the same rock faces as the far older paintings beneath and beside them. This continuity across the point of European contact is itself significant. Here is a tradition of rock art that was alive and active in 1788 and that continued to be practiced in the years after contact, absorbing new elements, new subjects, new animals and objects from the changed world, while maintaining the essential continuity of its tradition. The rock art did not stop, it adapted. In the southwest of Western Australia, in a landscape of Jarrah and Murray forests and granite outcrops and white sandy coastal plains, the Nyungar people maintained one of the most sophisticated systems of seasonal knowledge anywhere in Australia. The Nyungar calendar divides the year not into 4 seasons but into 6, each defined by the ecological and meteorological conditions specific to the southwest of Western Australia and each associated with different foods, different ceremonies, and different patterns of movement across the country. The 6 seasons, Birak, Bunuru, Jeran, Makuru, Jilba, and Kambarang, reflect the actual rhythms of this particular landscape far more accurately than the European 4 season model, which was developed for the conditions of northwestern Europe and which sits awkwardly over the very different conditions of the southern Australian coast. Birak, the 1st season of summer, is associated with hot, dry east winds and the availability of berries and small game. It is the season of fire management, when controlled burning of the coastal heathlands is most effective and most needed. Bunuru, the 2nd summer, is associated with the hottest and driest conditions, when the diet shifts toward different species and the pattern of movement changes to follow the availability of water. Jeran, the autumn, brings cooler nights and the beginning of seasonal change, signaled by the flowering of specific plants and the behavior of specific animals. Makuru, the cold season, brings rain and the return of certain food sources that have been absent through the dry months. Jilba, the transitional season of early spring, is a time of new growth and the return of warmth associated with the calving of kangaroos and the nesting of birds. Kambarang, the late spring, brings the flowering of the native orchids and the long grass and the abundance of a landscape responding to the return of warmth and moisture. Each of these seasons is not just a description of weather, it is a complete ecological briefing for the management of a specific landscape, encoding in a single word a whole suite of practical information about what is available, where to go, what to do, and what to prepare for. The Nyungar 6 season calendar is now being incorporated into school curricula and government communications in Western Australia, a recognition of its accuracy and its cultural importance. The botanical knowledge of the Nyungar people is itself a remarkable body of work. The Southwest Botanical Province of Western Australia is one of the most biodiverse regions on Earth, home to an extraordinary number of plant species found nowhere else. The Nyungar identified and named and understood the properties of a significant proportion of these species, many of which were found when European botanists and pharmacologists examined them, to have the medicinal and nutritional properties that the Nyungar had assigned to them. The quandong, the zamia nut, the many species of wattle with edible seeds and bark of medicinal value, the coastal plants with their specific seasonal and medicinal uses, all of these were known and used with a depth of knowledge that took European science generations to begin to appreciate. There is a place in the Simpson Desert, in the vast red dune field that stretches across the borders of Queensland, South Australia, and the Northern Territory, that is remarkable not for any single dramatic site, but for what it represents about the capacity of human beings to live, and to live well in conditions that appear inimical to any kind of sustained human occupation. The Simpson Desert is, by any reasonable measure, one of the most extreme environments on Earth in which human beings have made a permanent home. Its dunes, which run in parallel lines for hundreds of kilometers, are among the largest sand dunes in the world. Its temperatures range from the deeply cold at night in winter to above 50 degrees Celsius in summer. Its rainfall is sparse and unpredictable, sometimes failing entirely for years at a time. Its water sources are few and widely distributed, and knowing where they are requires knowledge that is both extensive and precise. The Aboriginal peoples who made their home in the Simpson Desert did so not in spite of these conditions, but by developing a body of knowledge that made those conditions survivable and, by their own account, richly satisfying. The knowledge required to live in the Simpson Desert includes the location of every significant water source in an enormous area, the ability to extract water from plants and from the soil in ways that are not obvious to the untrained eye, the understanding of the desert's ecology well enough to know where and when different food sources will be available, and the physical and mental conditioning required to travel long distances between water sources in extreme heat. These are not the skills of a primitive or desperate people. They are the skills of a highly adapted culture, operating with precision and confidence in a demanding environment that it knows intimately. The people of the Simpson Desert were not surviving despite their environment. They were thriving within it in ways that reflected 65,000 years of accumulated knowledge about how to live in the most ancient and most arid continent on Earth. At the northern end of the Gulf of Carpentaria, where the flatlands of the Northern Territory drain slowly into the warm, shallow waters of the Gulf, there is a tidal landscape of extraordinary complexity and richness. This is the country of the Yanyuwa people, a maritime culture whose world is defined by the sea and the tides and the complex ecology of the intertidal zone as much as by the land behind the shore. The Yanyuwa are one of the few Aboriginal groups for whom the sea has always been as central to cultural and ceremonial life as the land. Their dreaming stories are sea stories as much as land stories, connecting the movements of ancestral beings to the features of the seafloor and the behavior of the tidal currents, as well as to the rocks and trees and waterholes of the terrestrial landscape. Their ceremonial life incorporates the rhythms of the sea in ways that reflect generations of intimate knowledge of marine ecosystems. The Yanyuwa maintain a detailed knowledge of the dugong, the large marine mammal that grazes on the seagrass beds of the Gulf, that is both scientific in its accuracy and deeply embedded in ceremonial and philosophical understanding. The dugong is not just a food source in Yanyuwa understanding. It is a relative and ancestral being, a presence in the dreaming whose relationship with the Yanyuwa people is one of mutual obligation and respect. The Yanyuwa understanding of dugong behavior, of their seasonal movements and feeding patterns and breeding biology, is knowledge that has been tested and refined over thousands of years of direct observation, and it has been found by marine biologists who have worked with Yanyuwa knowledge holders to be accurate and detailed in ways that complement and extend the scientific record. This pattern of traditional ecological knowledge being found to be accurate and informative when tested against scientific evidence is repeated across Australia and across virtually every domain of ecological knowledge that has been studied in this way. It is not a coincidence. It is the predictable outcome of thousands of years of careful, sustained observation by people whose survival depended on the accuracy of what they knew. One of the most remarkable stories in the archaeology of ancient Australia concerns a place called Madukarai, sometimes referred to in the archaeological literature by its location description rather than its name. A series of sites in the southeast of South Australia that preserve evidence of one of the most extraordinary episodes in the deep history of the continent. Approximately 40,000 years ago, in the southeast of what is now South Australia, there existed a vast lake system known to geologists as Lake Bungunia. Lake Bungunia was, at its maximum extent, one of the largest lakes in the southern hemisphere, covering an area of some 33,000 square kilometers, and supporting an ecosystem of extraordinary richness. It was surrounded by forests and grasslands that bore little resemblance to the dry landscapes of present-day southeastern Australia. And it supported populations of the great megafauna, the giant wombats and diprotodons and kangaroos that would disappear from the continent sometime during the period of early human occupation. The sites around the ancient shorelines of Lake Bungunya and its successor systems in the region contain the physical traces of the people who lived along those shores, who hunted the megafauna in the forests and grasslands, who fished in the lake and gathered plants along its banks. The dates from these sites, combined with the dates from the megafauna remains found in the same deposits, are part of the complex and still unresolved debate about the relationship between human arrival and megafaunal extinction. What is striking about these sites in the context of tonight's story is the sheer ordinariness of what was found there. Hearths, stone tools, the bones of food animals, the traces of camps made and abandoned and made again across many generations. These are not the dramatic monuments of a high civilization. They are the accumulated evidence of everyday life, of people going about the ordinary business of survival in a rich and demanding landscape, and doing so with the skill and the knowledge and the cultural richness that 65,000 years of accumulated tradition provides. The ordinariness is, in its way, the most striking thing of all, not because there is nothing remarkable here, but because the remarkable thing is not exceptional achievement or dramatic creation. It is continuity. It is the simple, sustained fact of being here, day after day, generation after generation, in the same relationship with the same landscape, for longer than any other human culture anywhere on Earth. There is something else worth pausing on as this long journey through ancient Australia approaches its end. Something that is easy to miss in the accumulation of specific sites and specific traditions and specific pieces of evidence, but that is in many ways the most important thing of all. The story of the first Australians is not a story of the past. It is a story of the present. The people we have been speaking about tonight are not an ancient, vanished civilization. They are here. They are alive. They are the living descendants of the people who sat beneath the rock shelter at Majid Bebe 65,000 years ago, who laid ochre on the bones of Mungo Man 40,000 years ago, who built the eel traps at Budj Bim 6,600 years ago. There are approximately 800,000 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in Australia today. They live in every state and territory, in cities and towns and small communities and remote outstations. They are doctors and lawyers and engineers and artists and teachers and politicians and scientists and writers. They are also, many of them, knowledge holders, ceremony makers, language speakers, country managers, people who carry within themselves and within their communities the living thread of the oldest continuous culture on Earth. That thread has been stretched and damaged and in places broken by the events of colonization, but it has never been fully severed, and in the recovery and revival work of the past several decades, it has been gathering strength again. The Yolngu painter who creates bark paintings in the tradition of their ancestors is not making museum pieces. They are making living art, embedded in living ceremony, connected to living country and living relationships, and a living philosophical tradition that is as vital and as relevant as it has ever been. The Warlpiri linguist who records and teaches their language is not preserving a dead artifact. They are maintaining a living system of knowledge, keeping alive a way of understanding and describing the world that contains within it insights and information that the world needs. The Aboriginal ranger who conducts traditional burning on their country is not performing a historical reenactment. They are practicing the most sophisticated land management system ever developed for Australian landscapes, applying knowledge that is both very old and, in the conditions of climate change and ecological disruption that face Australia today, urgently needed. This is the most important thing to understand about the story of the first Australians, and it is the thing that tonight's account is most fundamentally trying to convey. This is not a story about what happened long ago and is now finished. It is a story about what is happening now and what it means for all of us who share this ancient land. The oldest story on Earth is still being told, and the telling of it matters more right now than it may ever have mattered before. There is a final image to carry with you into sleep. In the soft light of an Australian evening, somewhere in the country of any one of the hundreds of communities whose people have managed this land since the deep past, an elder sits with a child. The child is young enough that everything is still new and strange and full of wonder. The elder is old enough to have carried the knowledge of their people for many decades, to have learned it in the slow, careful way that such knowledge must be learned, through ceremony and practice and the patient attention of many years. The elder begins to speak, to tell a story about this place, this stretch of country, this specific piece of the world where they are both sitting in the fading light. A story about how this place came to be the way it is, about what happened here in the time of the dreaming, about the ancestral beings who moved through this country and in moving made it, leaving behind them the hills and the water holes and the trees and the particular slant of the light at this hour of the evening. The child listens, the way children listen when the story is good, which this one is, which this one has always been, because it has been told and refined across more generations than either of them can count. The child's eyes are wide and still, and in those eyes is the beginning of an understanding that will take a lifetime to complete. A lifetime of learning and ceremony and engagement with the country that will, if it goes well, make this child another link in the longest chain of human memory on Earth. This scene, or something very like it, has been playing out in Australia every evening for 65,000 years. Different elders, different children, different places. The same essential transmission, the same essential gift of the past to the future. It is still happening, somewhere in Australia tonight, as the light fades and the first stars appear, and the country settles into its ancient quiet. An elder is telling a story to a child. The oldest story, the most important story, the story of how to be alive in this particular place, in this particular world, with the particular responsibilities and the particular gifts that this place has always given to the people who belong to it. Listen. In the long quiet of the Australian night, you can almost hear it. There is a river in southwestern Queensland, slow and wide, and the colour of weak tea, that has a name in several of the languages of its traditional custodians, and a different name in the maps of the colonists who imposed their own terminology on a landscape they were still learning to read. The river is the Bulu. It drains a vast, flat catchment of red clay and saltbush and blue-grey mulga scrub. a landscape so level and so spare that the sky above it seems larger than any sky has a right to be. Along the banks of the Bulu and its tributary channels, scattered across an area of many hundreds of square kilometers, there are middens, shell middens, accumulations of the remains of freshwater mussels that were harvested from the river and eaten over generations so numerous that the resulting midden deposits are sometimes meters deep and extend across areas measured in hectares. Some of the middens along the Bulu system have been dated to several thousand years ago, making them among the oldest food processing sites in the interior of Australia. The middens are not just food waste. They are in the way of all archaeological deposits, a compressed record of human life across time. Embedded in the layers of shell are stone tools, the charcoal from ancient hearths, the bones of other food animals, and occasionally the personal ornaments and other objects that tell us something about the people who left them. Each layer of a midden is a moment in time, sealed beneath subsequent layers, preserved by the alkaline chemistry of the shell that surrounds it. Reading a midden is a slow and painstaking process. Archaeologists working through the deposits at sites like those along the Bulu sieve the sediment in fine mesh screens, separating the tiny fragments of bone and charcoal and stone from the matrix of shell and clay, cataloging and analyzing each layer with a care that mirrors, in its own way, the care that went into the making of the deposit in the first place. People gathered here over and over across many generations to harvest mussels from the river and cook them on fires that left charcoal in the sediment, and eat the flesh and discard the shells and leave, layer by layer, this slow archive of their presence. The middens of the Bulu are one of thousands of similar sites scattered across Australia. From the great shell middens of the coastal regions to the freshwater mussel middens of the inland rivers to the seed grinding sites of the arid zones where generations of people process the seeds of grasses and wattles into flour. Each of these sites is a record. Each is a place where the continuous thread of human presence on this continent left a physical mark in the earth. Together, they form a map of occupation so dense and so widespread that the question ceases to be where the first Australians were and becomes instead a question of where, in all this immense landscape, they were not. The answer, based on the archaeological evidence, is essentially nowhere. From the rainforests of the wet tropics to the hyper-arid core of the western desert. From the snow fields of the snowy mountains to the mangrove swamps of the northern coasts. From the cold, windswept subantarctic islands of Macquarie and Heard to the tropical coral cays of the Great Barrier Reef. Everywhere that Australia has land, or had land before the sea level rise of 10,000 years ago covered it, people were. Not visiting, not passing through, living there, managing that country, knowing it intimately, belonging to it. There is a conversation that occasionally happens between people who are learning about the depth of Aboriginal Australian history for the first time, and it tends to arrive at a question that is genuinely difficult and genuinely important. The question is this: given what we know, given the depth and the duration and the sophistication of the first Australians' relationship with their continent, what is the appropriate response from those of us who came here from elsewhere, whose presence here began with an act of dispossession and whose benefits here have been built, at least in part, on the exclusion of the people who were already here? It is a question that has no simple answer. It is a question that the broader Australian society is still working through slowly and not always gracefully in the ongoing conversations about land rights and treaty and truth telling and the proper forms of recognition and respect that the history demands. But what the archaeological and cultural record that we have been exploring tonight makes unmistakably clear is the scale of what was here before 1788. Not a thin scattering of people wandering aimlessly across an empty land. A rich and complex civilization in the broadest sense of that word, occupying every corner of a continent, managing it with sophistication and care, maintaining the oldest continuous cultural tradition on Earth, and doing all of this across a span of time that makes every other human achievement look recent. Recognizing this is not simply a matter of fairness, though it is certainly that. It is a matter of accuracy. It is about telling the true story of this continent, the whole story from the beginning. Not beginning in 1788, but beginning where the story actually begins, in the deep past of 65,000 years ago on a northern shore, under a rock overhang where someone with a ground edge hatchet sat in the afternoon light and looked out across a landscape they and their descendants would know and love and manage and sing for longer than any other people have ever known and loved and managed and sung any place on earth. That is the beginning. And from that beginning, across all the tens of thousands of years that followed, across all the changes and the continuities, the songs and the ceremonies and the stars and the fires and the eel traps and the petroglyphs and the bones of the dead lying ochred in the earth, across all of it, right up to this night and this moment and the voice that is carrying these words to you, that beginning is still unfolding. There is nothing else quite like it in human history. There is no other example of a culture this old, this continuous, this detailed in its engagement with a specific place, this sophisticated in its systems for preserving and transmitting knowledge, still alive and present and continuing today. This is the thing to take with you into sleep tonight. Not a list of dates and sites and archaeological findings, though those are part of it. Not a narrative of loss and resilience, though that is part of it too. But the simple, extraordinary, humbling fact that the oldest story on Earth is not a story that ended long ago. It is a story that is happening right now, tonight, in this country, in the ceremonies being conducted in the warm dark of the northern country, in the language classes where children are learning words that carry within them the accumulated understanding of thousands of generations, in the ranger programs where young people are learning the knowledge of their elders and applying it to the land, in the conversations between knowledge holders and scientists that are producing new understandings of both the past and the present, in the art being made in studios and on country, in galleries and in desert sand, in styles both ancient and new. In all of this, the oldest story continues. It adapts, it endures. It finds new ways to carry its ancient knowledge forward into a changed world. It does what it has always done, across 65,000 years of change and challenge and continuity. It persists, as the land itself persists, patient and ancient and full of an attention that is older than memory and more durable than stone. The stars above Australia on a clear night are extraordinary. In the southern hemisphere, far from the light pollution of cities, the Milky Way is not a faint suggestion, but a solid presence, a river of light that runs from one horizon to the other, so dense and so bright that it seems less like sky and more like something you could reach out and touch. Before the darkness takes over completely, Let us linger one moment longer in the country, in the specific quality of silence that belongs to this land at nightfall. There is a particular sound, or rather a particular texture of sound, that the Australian bush produces at the transition between day and night. The last of the day birds, the kookaburras and the butcher birds and the lorikeets, fall silent. The first of the night sounds begin, the soft rhythmic calling of frogs along the creek lines, the occasional distant cry of a stone curlew, the rustle of something small moving through the dry grass. And between these sounds, brief intervals of a silence so complete and so ancient that it seems to have weight, to have texture, to be made of something more substantial than the mere absence of noise. This is the silence that has existed here every evening for 65,000 years. The same interval between day and night, the same quality of the air cooling and the light fading and the first stars appearing above the darkening tree line, the same sense of the world pausing between one state and another. Every generation of the first Australians has heard this silence. Every generation has known what it means and what it requires of the people who sit within it. It requires presence, it requires attentiveness, it requires the particular kind of quiet that is not passivity, but a form of acute receptiveness, an openness to the signals that the country sends when the noise of the day has subsided and the land begins to speak in its own voice. This is what 65,000 years of inhabiting a place teaches. It teaches you to listen, not just with your ears, but with your whole body, with your understanding of what this place is and how it works and what it needs from you tonight. It teaches you that the land is not a backdrop to your life, but the condition of your life, the substance out of which your life is made, the thing that holds you and feeds you and teaches you who you are. That knowledge, earned across the longest human story on Earth, is the gift that tonight has been attempting in its slow and careful way to deliver to you, not as information to be filed and forgotten, but as a quality of attention, a way of being present in the world, a reminder that where you are is ancient and alive and full of a meaning that reaches back further than any of us can see and forward further than any of us can imagine. Rest now. The land is old and patient, and it will still be here when you wake. The oldest story will still be continuing in the morning. All the stories will still be carrying their long knowledge through another day and another night, as they have been, unbroken since the very first morning of the human world. There is one last thing, a small thing perhaps, but one worth carrying. Every culture on Earth has a story about where it came from. Every people has an account of its origins, of how it came to be in the place where it finds itself, of what that place means to it and what it means to the place. These are among the oldest stories that human beings tell, and they are among the most important, because they are the stories that tell a people who it is. For most of the world's cultures, these origin stories reach back a few thousand years at most. The Hebrews trace their story to Abraham. The Greeks trace theirs to a time of gods and heroes that they placed, by their own reckoning, not very far before their historical memory began. The Chinese trace their civilization to the Yellow Emperor, the ancient Indians to the Vedic seers. These are all beautiful and important stories, and they reach back as far as the written record and the oral tradition of those cultures can stretch. For the first Australians, the origin story reaches back 65,000 years. And it does not end with an arrival. It does not describe a journey from somewhere else to this place. It describes a creation. It describes the dreaming, the time before time that is also right now, in which the ancestral beings moved across a not yet formed landscape and in moving made it what it is. The land itself is the origin story. The country is the text in which the beginning is written, and the beginning has no end, because it is still happening, because the dreaming is not the past, but the underlying reality of the present, and the present is always and continuously emerging from it. This is, when you sit with it long enough, one of the most profound relationships between a people and a place that has ever been articulated anywhere. A relationship so deep and so long that it has passed beyond history into something like geology, something like the slow movement of water through ancient stone, patient beyond any individual measure of time, wearing its way toward a depth that no outside eye can fully see. 65,000 years, the oldest story, this land, this sky, these stars. Before we leave the country entirely and surrender to sleep, there is a quality of the Australian night that deserves one final description, because it is a quality that belongs to the continent the way few qualities belong to any place on earth. It is the quality of depth. Not depth in the sense of profundity, though there is that too. Depth in the most literal sense, as though the darkness here has a physical dimension that the darkness of other places does not. As though the space between you and the stars is not empty but full of something that has no name in the languages that were brought here from elsewhere, but that has many names in the languages that grew here across 65,000 years of continuous attention to exactly this quality, of exactly this sky above exactly this ancient land. The people who named it are still here. Their language is still being spoken somewhere under this same sky. Their ceremonies are still being conducted in the warm dark of communities scattered across the breadth of the continent, maintaining the connections and the obligations and the knowledge that have always made this place what it is. All of that is present in the depth of the Australian night. All of it is there. In the silence between the stars, in the old land that breathes below them, in the long unbroken story that runs from the first morning of human life here to this evening and on into tomorrow morning, unstoppable and patient and still against all the odds of history, alive. And there is a kind of peace available to anyone who allows themselves to be held just for a moment by the scale of that continuity, not the peace of having resolved anything or understood everything, or arrived at any final answer. The peace of recognizing that you are very small and that the world is very large, and that both of those things are true in the most beautiful possible way. The peace of being one point in a long story, in a land old enough to hold the whole span of human memory without strain, under a sky that has been the companion of human beings on this continent for longer than anywhere else on Earth. Breathe. Let the ancient quiet of the Australian night settle over you like the dark itself, like the soft accumulation of dust over the layers of 1,000 generations, gentle and patient and absolute. The oldest story is still being told, and tonight, for a little while, you have been part of it. It is enough to know that. To carry it lightly like a smooth stone in a pocket. Something with weight and warmth and substance, something that has been shaped over a very long time into exactly the form it needs to be. Something that fits in the hand as though it was made for it. Because in a way that is not entirely metaphorical, it was. The stories of the first Australians were made for the human hand and the human mind and the human heart across 65,000 years of refinement, tested against every kind of experience the world offers, kept and carried and passed on by people who understood that the most valuable thing one generation can give to the next is not wealth and not property and not power, but knowledge. And not just any knowledge, but the particular, specific, irreplaceable knowledge of how to be alive in this place, with these people, under this sky, with the care and the attention and the love that the world requires of those who wish to remain in it. That knowledge is the inheritance of everyone who lives on this continent. Not to possess or to claim, but to acknowledge and to honor. And in the acknowledging, perhaps, to learn something about how we might all carry it forward into whatever comes next. There is a generosity in the way that the first Australians have always shared this country with those who came after them. A generosity that is not the same thing as consent and should never be confused with it, but that is nonetheless real, encoded in the very openness of the country itself, in the way that a land this ancient and this absorbing invites anyone with the willingness to be quiet and to pay attention into a relationship with it that is transformative, that changes something fundamental in the way a person understands their own place in the world. Australia does this to people, to those who come to it from elsewhere and stay long enough to begin to hear what it is saying. The land itself is the teacher, the land itself is the archive, and the people whose knowledge of it runs deepest are the people whose ancestors have been listening to it for 65,000 years. We would do well to listen to them, and perhaps that is the simplest and the truest thing that tonight's long journey through the deep Australian past arrives at. Not a list of facts, not a catalogue of achievements, not an argument to be won or a case to be made, just a listening, a willingness to be quiet long enough to hear something very old and very true and very alive speaking through the oldest sites of the world's most ancient continent across 65,000 years of unbroken human presence. Into this moment, this night, this particular quietness in which you find yourself. Listen, the first Australians looked at this sky for 65,000 years. They mapped it, they read it. They used it for navigation, for calendar, for ceremony, for the teaching of the young about the relationships between things. The emu in the sky, the great fish of the Milky Way, the dark emu's nest at the Southern Cross, the stories encoded in the movements of the celestial bodies, stories that are also, at the same time, practical guides to the seasonal rhythms of the landscape below. And those stories are still alive in communities across the continent, in the cities and towns and the deep country. They are being told and sung and taught to the next generation. Not without difficulty, not without loss, not without the ongoing weight of what was taken, but alive, still alive. Tonight, as you close your eyes, that sky is still there above you. The same stars that looked down on the people who sat under the overhang at Majid Bebe 65,000 years ago, grinding their hatchets and mixing their ochre and preparing for whatever ceremony the night required. The same stars that shone on the shores of Lake Mungo when the ochre-stained bones of Mungo Man were laid with such care in the earth. The hands folded over the body in a gesture that speaks of love and grief and the human need to honor what is past. The same stars that illuminate the eel traps at Budj Bim, now silent in the cool Victorian evening, stones laid by hands that understood the movements of water and the habits of eels and the proper relationship between people and the land they ate from. The same stars that make the petroglyphs of Murujuga glow faintly in the long Australian night. 1 million engravings covering 1 million rocks. the largest conversation in stone that any people anywhere have ever left behind, the same stars that the Gwion painters saw as they worked in the deep Kimberley, adding their floating figures to the rock wall. The same stars that the astronomers of Wadi Yoang studied as they placed their stones along the lines of solstice and equinox. The same stars that guided the Torres Strait Islanders across the open water between their islands. 65,000 years of continuous human presence. 65,000 years of watching the stars and reading the land and maintaining the ceremonies and passing down the stories and learning, always learning, the particular and irreplaceable knowledge of how to live in this particular and irreplaceable place. The world's most isolated continent, and on it, the world's oldest human story. Not a story about the past, a story that is happening now, in the ceremonies being conducted across the country, in the languages being taught to children who will teach them to their own children, in the fire management programs being carried out on country by people whose families have been managing that country since before agriculture existed anywhere on earth, in the conversations happening between traditional knowledge holders and scientists who are only beginning to understand what they have to learn. A story still being told, still being sung, still being carried forward by the people who have always carried it across the vast and luminous dark of the Australian night. Let that stay with you as you sleep, the oldest story, still alive, still here, still flowing forward like water finding its way through ancient stone, patient and persistent and unhurried, carrying everything it has gathered over an unimaginable span of time, all the way to this moment and on into whatever comes next. You have been listening to History for Sleep. If tonight's journey stayed with you, sharing it with someone who might find comfort in it helps this channel continue growing. New episodes are released regularly, and subscribing ensures that they find their way to you when you need them. Rest well. We will be here when you return.